Eleanor Brooks stood on a train platform in the middle of nowhere, clutching a telegram that had destroyed her life in Boston and handed her a future she didn't understand. The words blurred through her tears. "Uncle Samuel deceased. Ranch yours. Come immediately." Behind her, the train's whistle screamed its final warning before disappearing into the vast Colorado horizon. Ahead lay 2,000 acres she'd never seen, cattle she didn't know how to raise, and a land that had already killed the only family member who'd ever left her anything. She had $73, one trunk of belongings, and absolutely no idea how to survive what came next. This wasn't inheritance. It was a death sentence wrapped in property deeds. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Eleanor's story travels. Hit that like button and stay until the end, because what happens on that Colorado ranch will change everything you think you know about survival, strength, and second chances. The stagecoach hit another rut, and Eleanor's head cracked against the wooden frame hard enough to make her vision swim. She didn't cry out. There was no point. The driver couldn't hear her over the thunder of hooves and wheels, and the two other passengers, a whiskey drummer and a miner's wife, had stopped trying to make conversation 50 miles back when the road turned from rough to punishing. Eleanor pressed her palm against the bruise forming at her temple and stared through the dust-caked window at landscape that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Endless plains rolled toward mountains so distant they looked painted onto the sky. No trees, no buildings, no signs of civilization beyond the rutted track they followed and occasional markers where previous travelers had buried their dead. Boston felt like another lifetime. She could still see her landlady's face when she'd announced she was leaving, that mixture of pity and relief that told Eleanor exactly what her neighbors thought of her prospects. Poor thing. No family, no husband, no future. The seamstress shop where she'd worked had closed 3 months ago, and her savings had evaporated paying rent on a room barely large enough for a bed and wash stand. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who'd waited expectantly for a tip she couldn't afford to give. Samuel Brooks, deceased, stop ranch and holdings. Now yours, stop lawyer, advises immediate travel to settle estate, stop, contact Henderson and Sons, Leadville, Colorado. Stop. Uncle Samuel. She'd met him exactly twice in her 26 years. Once when she was 7 and he'd passed through Boston on his way west, smelling of tobacco and telling wild stories about gold strikes and Indian raids. The second time at her father's funeral, when Samuel had stood awkwardly at the graveside before disappearing again into whatever life he'd built in the territories. She hadn't expected to ever see him again. She certainly hadn't expected him to die and leave her everything he owned. The lawyer's follow-up letter had been more detailed and significantly less encouraging. The ranch comprised 2,000 acres in the Wet Mountain Valley, approximately 30 miles from the nearest town of any size. Current livestock included an estimated 200 head of cattle, though recent losses to winter kill and predators had reduced the herd substantially. The property included a main house, barn, stable, and various outbuildings in unknown condition. Outstanding debts totaled nearly $800, payable to various creditors within 90 days of the estate settlement. The property could be sold, the lawyer had written, though finding a buyer for such a remote holding may prove difficult. Alternative arrangement might be made to hire management, though this would require significant capital investment you may not possess. The meaning had been clear enough: come west and try to run a ranch you know nothing about, or lose everything to debt and distance. Eleanor had sold what little she owned, bought the cheapest train ticket west, and packed her life into a single trunk. She'd sat in that Boston boarding house on her last night in the city, staring at the walls that had witnessed her slow decline from respectable tradesperson to desperate woman with no prospects, and decided that dying in Colorado couldn't possibly be worse than the slow starvation awaiting her in Boston. Now, watching that impossible landscape roll past, she wasn't entirely sure she'd made the right choice. The stagecoach lurched to a stop so suddenly that Eleanor pitched forward, catching herself against the seat opposite. The miner's wife clutched her handbag and peered nervously through the window. "What is it?" the whiskey drummer demanded. "Indians?" The driver's voice came down from above, rough and unconcerned. "Creek crossing. Everybody out. Too much weight for the current." Eleanor climbed down into ankle-deep mud, her Boston shoes immediately soaking through. The creek ran fast and brown with snowmelt, wider than it had any right to be this late in spring. On the far bank, she could see where the road continued, a faint track disappearing into more emptiness. "How much farther to Westcliff?" she asked the driver as he led the horses forward. He spat tobacco juice into the water. 6 miles, give or take. Be there before dark if this crossing don't wash out the axle." 6 miles. Eleanor looked down at her ruined shoes, at the mud caking her skirt hem, at her hands that had spent years pushing needles through fabric and now trembled from exhaustion and fear. 6 miles might as well be 60. They made the crossing without incident, though the coach tilted at an angle that had the miner's wife praying aloud and the drummer reaching for his flask. On the far side, Eleanor climbed back inside with water squelching in her shoes and her skirt weighing 10 pounds from absorbed mud. The whiskey drummer offered her the flask. "First time west?" "Yes." "Visiting family?" "Inheriting property." He whistled low. "Ranch?" "So I'm told." "You know anything about ranching?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "Not a single thing." He laughed, not unkindly. "Well, you're honest. That's worth something out here." He took a pull from his flask and settled back against the seat. "Advice, though? Sell it. Take whatever you can get and go back east before this country breaks you. It ain't made for women alone." "I have nowhere to go back to." The drummer studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then I hope you're tougher than you look, miss, because this land don't care about your circumstances. It'll kill you just as dead whether you deserve it or not." The sun was setting when they finally rolled into Westcliff. Eleanor had imagined something, a town at least. What she found was a collection of buildings that looked temporary even in their construction, as if the whole settlement might pick up and move tomorrow. A general store, a saloon, a livery, a handful of other structures she couldn't identify in the fading light. The stage stopped in front of a building with a painted sign, Mountain Pride Hotel. Through the window, Eleanor could see a dining room with perhaps a dozen tables, half of them occupied. "End of the line," the driver announced, already climbing down to unload luggage. Eleanor stepped out onto a street that was more mud than road. Her trunk landed beside her with a thud that spoke volumes about the driver's opinion of Boston leather. The other passengers disappeared into the hotel without looking back, and Eleanor found herself alone on a street in a town she'd never heard of until 3 weeks ago, in a territory that felt as foreign as the moon. "You need help with that trunk, miss." The voice came from a man standing in the doorway of the livery stable, tall, weathered, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the surrounding mountains. He wore work clothes that had seen better years, and a hat that had seen better decades. "I'm looking for the offices of Henderson and Sons," Eleanor said. "The law firm?" "Closed for the night. Henderson keeps town hours, even though most of us work by daylight." The man walked over, moved her trunk aside with an ease that made Eleanor acutely aware of how much she'd struggled with it in Boston. "You're Brooks's niece, I take it." Eleanor blinked. "How did you know?" "Small valley, word travels. Besides, Henderson's been telling everyone who'd listen that Samuel's city niece was coming to claim the ranch." He stuck out a hand. "Caleb Mercer. I run the place next to yours." Eleanor shook his hand, feeling calluses that made her own needle-worn fingers seem soft by comparison. "Eleanor Brooks. I'm afraid I don't know anything about ranching, Mr. Mercer. I'm a seamstress by trade." "So I heard." He released her hand and studied her with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. Her inappropriate clothing, her obvious exhaustion, her complete unsuitability for frontier life. "You planning to keep the place or sell?" "I don't know yet. I suppose that depends on what I find when I see it." Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "Fair enough. You'll need somewhere to stay tonight. Hotel's clean enough, though the food's nothing special. Henderson will be in his office come morning, 9 o'clock sharp. He's particular about punctuality." "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." He touched his hat brim and turned back toward the livery. Eleanor watched him go, then looked up at the hotel sign again. The last of her money would cover perhaps a week of room and board, maybe less if meals were expensive. After that, she pushed the thought away and went inside. The hotel clerk was a thin woman with suspicious eyes who quoted prices that made Eleanor's stomach drop. She paid for 3 nights in advance, took the key to a second-floor room, and dragged her trunk upstairs that creaked ominously under the combined weight. The room was small, spare, and miraculously clean. A bed, a washstand, a single chair by a window that looked out over the street. Eleanor sat on the bed and felt the events of the past weeks crash over her like a wave. The train journey, the stagecoach, the endless miles of nothing, the reality of where she was and what she faced. She didn't cry. She'd cried herself empty back in Boston, in that boarding house room, the night she'd decided to come west. Now there was just a cold, clear understanding of her situation. She had inherited property she didn't know how to manage, in a place she didn't understand, with debts she couldn't pay and skills that were useless here. The whiskey drummer had been right. She should sell, take whatever pittance she could get, and go. Where? Eleanor stood and walked to the window. The street below was emptying as darkness fell. Lantern light spilled from the saloon and she could hear men's laughter, rough and easy. Somewhere a dog barked. The mountains loomed black against a sky turning deep purple, and stars were beginning to appear, more stars than she'd ever seen in Boston, scattered across the heavens like someone had spilled diamonds. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and made herself face the truth she'd been avoiding since that telegram arrived. There was no going back. Boston held nothing for her. She had no family, no friends with means to help her, no prospects beyond a slow slide into poverty, and worse. Coming west had been desperation, not courage. But she was here now, and whether by foolishness or fate, a ranch in the Colorado Territory belonged to her. Eleanor moved to her trunk and unpacked methodically. 3 dresses, undergarments, a few personal items that had belonged to her mother. At the bottom, wrapped in an old shawl, she found the photograph. Her father, young and serious, standing next to Uncle Samuel, who grinned at the camera like life was the best joke ever told. 2 brothers, one who'd stayed in Boston and died quietly, one who'd gone west and apparently died just as hard. She propped the photograph on the washstand and studied her uncle's face. What had he been thinking, leaving everything to a niece he barely knew? Had he imagined she could actually run a ranch? Or had he simply had no one else to leave it to? Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by unfamiliar sounds. Wind against the building, voices from the saloon, the strange silence that exists only in places far from cities. Eleanor drifted in and out of dreams where she stood in an empty field while cattle she couldn't control stampeded toward mountains she couldn't reach. She woke before dawn to the sound of wagons in the street below. By the time she'd washed and dressed, the sun was rising over those impossible mountains, painting them gold and pink and making them look almost welcoming. The hotel dining room served breakfast, eggs, bacon, bread that was somehow both burnt and undercooked. Eleanor forced herself to eat, knowing she couldn't afford to waste food no matter how it tasted. The other guests ignored her, engaged in their own conversations about ore strikes and water rights, and the price of beef in Denver. At 8:45, she stepped out into a morning that was already warm with the promise of real heat to come. The law office was easy to find, one of the more substantial buildings, with a painted sign and actual glass in the windows. She was reaching for the door when it opened from inside. A man in his 50s, well-dressed by frontier standards, looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been expecting bad news and was now having it confirmed. "Miss Brooks, I presume?" "Mr. Henderson?" "Indeed. Please, come in." He held the door, ushered her into an office that smelled of paper and tobacco. "I received word you'd arrived last night. I trust your journey was adequate?" Eleanor sat in the chair he indicated. "It was long, Mr. Henderson. I'm eager to see the property and understand exactly what I've inherited." Henderson settled behind his desk with the air of a man preparing to deliver a sermon he didn't want to give. "Your uncle's estate is complicated, Miss Brooks. The property itself is substantial, 2,000 acres in the Wet Mountain Valley, good grazing land when properly managed. The house is sound, built of log and stone, barn, stable, various outbuildings. Your uncle ran cattle, approximately 300 head at the peak of his operation." "Approximately?" "Counting cattle on open range is an imprecise science. Your uncle kept records, though his bookkeeping grew erratic toward the end. Henderson pulled out a ledger, opened it to reveal pages of cramped handwriting. The current herd likely numbers between 150 and 200 head, accounting for winter losses and predation. Market value, assuming successful roundup and drive to Denver, would be roughly $4,000. Eleanor's heart lifted slightly. $4,000. That was more money than she'd seen in her entire life. Henderson's next words crushed that brief hope. However, the estate carries significant debt. Your uncle borrowed against the property to purchase breeding stock 3 years ago. That loan, with accumulated interest, now totals $640, payable to the Cattlemen's Bank in Cannon City. Additionally, there are outstanding accounts with the general store here in Westcliff totaling $170, feed and supply bills from various merchants adding another $200, and, he paused, looking genuinely pained, taxes on the property for the past 2 years, which your uncle apparently chose not to pay. That's another $300. Eleanor did the arithmetic in her head. Over $1,300 in total? $1,350, to be precise. Due within 90 days of estate settlement, which I'm required to initiate now that you've arrived. Henderson closed the ledger. Miss Brooks, I'll be direct because I believe you deserve honesty. Selling the cattle and property would likely cover those debts with perhaps a small amount remaining. However, conducting a proper roundup, drive, and sale requires knowledge and resources you don't possess. If you attempt to manage the property yourself without experience, I'll fail. Almost certainly. This is difficult country, Miss Brooks. Your uncle was a capable rancher, and even he struggled in recent years. The land is unforgiving, the work is brutal. Without help, significant help, you have no realistic chance of success. Eleanor sat silent for a moment, absorbing this. Everything the whiskey drummer had said, confirmed by a lawyer who had no reason to lie. She should thank Mr. Henderson for his honesty, sign whatever papers he put in front of her, and arrange for the quickest possible sale. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What kind of help?" Henderson blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "You said without significant help, I have no chance. What kind of help would I need to actually run the ranch rather than sell it?" The lawyer studied her with new attention. "You're seriously considering this?" "I'm considering all my options, Mr. Henderson. What would it take?" He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You would need someone to teach you every aspect of ranch operation, cattle management, land maintenance, water rights, seasonal cycles. You would need equipment you likely don't have and can't afford to purchase. You would need to execute a successful roundup this fall, which requires multiple hands and considerable skill. You would need to survive winter, which in this valley can be challenging. You would need luck, Miss Brooks. A great deal of luck. And if I had all that, if I found help and learned quickly and worked hard, then you would have a chance. Not a good chance, mind you, but a chance." Henderson pulled out another set of papers. "These are the estate documents. Once you sign, the property is legally yours, along with all debts and obligations. If you're genuinely considering keeping the ranch, I strongly suggest you visit the property first. See what you're actually contemplating before you make this decision final." "How do I get there?" "I can arrange a wagon. Mr. Mercer from the neighboring ranch has agreed to escort you if you're willing. He knew your uncle, knows the property. He's—" Henderson paused, choosing words carefully. "Skeptical of your prospects, but he's a fair man. He'll give you an honest assessment." Eleanor thought of the tall, weathered rancher who'd spoken to her last night. There had been no mockery in his directness, no cruelty in his doubt. Just the blunt honesty of someone who'd watched the land break people before. "When can we leave?" "This afternoon, if you're ready. It's about a 4-hour ride. You could see the property, stay overnight in the house, return tomorrow to make your final decision." Henderson met her eyes. "Miss Brooks, I've been practicing law in this territory for 15 years. I've seen people come west with all manner of dreams and schemes. Most fail, some survive. A very few actually succeed. I tell you this not to discourage you, but to ensure you understand what you're facing." "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Henderson." "Do you?" Because honestly means me telling you that a woman alone with no experience and no capital, attempting to run a cattle ranch in the wet mountain valley, has odds of success I wouldn't bet against even with someone else's money. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that only trembled slightly. Then I suppose I'd better see this impossible property before I decide whether to attempt the impossible. By noon, she was sitting beside Caleb Mercer on a wagon heading south out of Westcliff. Her trunk was in the back, along with supplies Henderson had suggested she'd need, basic foodstuffs, lamp oil, matches. The lawyer had offered to credit these against the estate, adding them to the debt she'd eventually need to settle. Caleb drove in silence, his attention on the rutted track that served as a road. Eleanor watched the landscape change as they left the town behind. Endless grassland broken by outcrops of red rock, scattered pine growing thicker as they moved toward the mountains. Cattle dotted the range, branded and moving slowly across grazing land. "Those yours?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Some. Others belong to the Hendricks spread to the west, Rollins' outfit to the north. We all run cattle on open range through here. Your uncle's brand was a broken S, looked like a snake. You'll see it on your herd, assuming we can find them." "Why wouldn't we find them?" Caleb glanced at her. "Because cattle don't stay put, Miss Brooks. They wander, get mixed with other herds, drift into canyons or high country. That's why we do roundups, gather everything together, sort by brand, move them where they need to be for season. Your uncle ran his cattle through the valley here in summer, higher meadows in fall, kept breeding stock close to the ranch in winter. But he's been dead 2 months now, and cattle don't wait for inheritance papers." Eleanor absorbed this. "So I might not actually have 200 head anymore." "Might have more, might have less. Won't know until roundup." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Henderson tell you about the debts?" "Yes." "And you're still coming to look at the place?" "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor considered the question. Because selling means going back to Boston with perhaps a few $100s and no prospects. Keeping it means at least trying something different. Different don't mean better, could mean dead. "I could die poor in Boston just as easily as dying poor in Colorado, Mr. Mercer. At least here I'd have tried." He made a sound that might have been a grunt of acknowledgement. "Your uncle said something similar when he first came out here." "At least I tried," he said. "Sounded noble then, too." "Did it work for him?" "For a while. He built something real. House, barn, herd. Had good years and bad, same as everyone. Then his wife died in childbirth, baby with her. After that," Caleb shook his head. "After that, he just sort of gave up slow. Kept the operation going, but his heart wasn't in it. Last couple years especially, he let things slide." "I didn't know he'd been married." "Lot you don't know about your uncle, I expect. He was a private man, but he was decent, and he worked hard when he had reason to. That ranch could be something again, with the right person running it." Eleanor heard the unspoken addendum, "But you're not the right person." They drove in silence for another hour. The track climbed gradually, the mountains growing larger ahead. Eleanor saw pronghorn antelope bounding across the grassland, a hawk riding thermals overhead, plants she couldn't identify blooming in colors she'd never seen in Boston's carefully tended gardens. It was beautiful. It was also terrifying in its vastness, in its complete indifference to human presence. "There," Caleb said, pointing. Eleanor looked where he indicated and saw buildings in the distance, log structures against the backdrop of mountains, tiny in all that space. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, animals should have been moving in the corrals, signs of life and human occupation. Instead, there was just stillness, the stillness of abandonment. As they drew closer, Eleanor could make out details. The main house was larger than she'd expected, built of logs chinked with what looked like mud and stone. A broad porch ran along the front, and actual glass windows reflected the afternoon sun. The barn was substantial, weathered but solid-looking. Smaller outbuildings scattered around. She guessed smokehouse, root cellar, maybe a bunkhouse. But everywhere there were signs of neglect. Fence rails down, corral gates hanging crooked, weeds growing unchecked around the buildings. The place didn't look ruined exactly. It looked like someone had stopped caring. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. The silence was profound. No wind, No animal sounds, just the creak of leather and wood as he set the brake. "Your inheritance," he said quietly. Eleanor climbed down without waiting for assistance. Her legs trembled from hours of sitting, but she forced herself to walk toward the house with her back straight. The porch steps were solid under her feet. The door was locked, but Henderson had given her keys, heavy iron things that looked older than she was. The lock turned with difficulty. The door swung inward with a groan of hinges. The smell hit her first, dust and stale air and the particular emptiness of a place where no one had lived for months. But underneath that, something else. The ghost of life once lived here. Coffee and wood smoke and leather. Eleanor stepped inside. The main room was larger than her entire Boston boarding house room had been. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and swept clean. Furniture that looked handmade but well-crafted. Table, chairs, a shelf holding perhaps 24 books. Through doorways she could see other rooms, shadows, and possibilities. She walked slowly through the house, her footsteps echoing on plank floors. A kitchen with a cast-iron stove and hand pump over a dry sink. 2 bedrooms, one with a bed frame and mattress that mice had gotten into, the other empty except for a trunk against one wall. Everything covered in dust, abandoned but not destroyed. This was where Uncle Samuel had lived, where he'd brought a wife, tried to build a family, watched dreams die. Eleanor returned to the main room and found Caleb standing in the doorway, hat in his hands. "Well?" he asked. She looked around again at the fireplace, the windows, the solid walls. "It needs work. Everything out here needs work. Question is whether you're capable of doing it." Eleanor met his eyes directly. "I don't know, Mr. Mercer. I honestly don't know if I can do this. But I know I can't go back to what I left behind." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but perhaps a recognition of determination, even if he thought it was foolish determination. "All right then, let me show you the rest while there's still daylight. You should know exactly what you're committing to if you're actually considering staying." They walked the property for the next 2 hours. Caleb showed her everything, the barn with stalls for 8 horses, though only 3 occupied them now. The corral system that could hold dozens of cattle when properly maintained. The creek that ran through the eastern section of the property, providing year-round water. The grazing land stretching toward the mountains, 2,000 acres that looked infinite to Eleanor's Boston eyes. He explained things as they walked, using terms she didn't understand but tried to memorize. Winter range and summer range, calf crop and breeding stock, hay cutting and roundup timing, water rights and fence maintenance. Each piece of information felt like another weight added to an already impossible burden. "Your uncle's brand is registered with the territorial office," Caleb said, as they stood looking out over land where cattle should have been visible but weren't. "That gives you legal claim to any animal carrying it, wherever they've wandered. But you'll need to prove you can maintain the operation to keep that registration. If the property's judged abandoned, those rights revert. How long do I have?" 90 days is standard for estate settlement. After that, if you haven't demonstrated active management, he shrugged. County could declare it abandoned, sell at auction to cover debts and taxes. 3 months. Eleanor tried to imagine everything she'd need to learn in 3 months just to prove she deserved to keep property she'd never asked for. The sun was setting when they returned to the house. Caleb unloaded her trunk and the supplies, carrying them inside with the casual strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime doing hard physical work. "I'll head back before full dark," he said. "You've got enough food for a few days, lamp oil to see by. Creek water's good for drinking if you boil it first. Stove works, though you'll need to clean out the flue before you trust it completely." "You're leaving me here alone? That's what you wanted, wasn't it? To see the property, understand what you're facing?" He moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Brooks, I'm going to give you the same advice I'd give anyone in your situation. This ranch could be made profitable again, but it would take knowledge you don't have, capital you can't access, and luck that's in short supply. Sell it. Take what money you can get and find something more suited to your circumstances." "Like what? Seamstress work? There's barely enough population in this valley to support one general store, let alone a dressmaker." "Then go where there is population. Denver maybe, Salt Lake. Somewhere you can use the skills you actually have." Eleanor looked around the empty house, at dust motes floating in the last sunlight coming through windows her uncle had installed. "And if I decided to stay anyway, To try? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then I'd say you're either braver or more foolish than anyone I've met in 20 years out here. Possibly both. He put his hat back on, tugged the brim low. There's a rifle in the bedroom trunk, loaded. You know how to shoot? No. Of course not, he sighed. Keep it by the bed anyway. Probably won't need it, but probably isn't the same as won't. Mr. Mercer. Caleb, if you're staying even temporarily, we're neighbors. Use my name. Caleb, if I did stay, if I decided to try, would you help me? He studied her with those weathered eyes that had seen too many people fail at exactly what she was proposing. Help you how? Teach me. What I'd need to know to run this place. Miss Brooks? Eleanor. Eleanor. He said her name like he was testing it, seeing how it fit in his mouth. I've got my own operation to run. Can't spend every day teaching city manners to someone who probably won't last a month. Then don't spend every day. Spend what time you can spare. I'll work for it. Whatever you need, I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I'm good with a needle, even if that's not useful with cattle. I'll trade labor for knowledge. You don't know what you're offering. The work here isn't like anything you've done before. It's dangerous, exhausting, and most days there's no proof you've accomplished anything except that the cattle haven't died yet. Then I'll learn that too. Caleb shook his head, but Eleanor saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not agreement, exactly. But maybe not total dismissal either. I'll think on it, he said finally. You spend tonight here. Figure out if you can even stand sleeping in a house this isolated. Tomorrow I'll come by around midday, take you back to town if you're ready to give up. If you're still determined to try this fool thing, he trailed off, then shrugged. We'll talk about what help might look like, if I'm willing to provide it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't heard my conditions. He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Get some rest. Tomorrow, if you're serious about this, the real work begins. And Miss Brooks? Eleanor? It's going to be harder than anything you can possibly imagine. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the porch steps, wagon wheels creaking as he drove away into the growing darkness. Eleanor stood in the doorway and watched until she couldn't see the wagon anymore, until there was nothing but darkness and stars and the sound of wind through grass. Then she closed the door, lit the lamp Caleb had left on the table, and looked around her inheritance. A house she didn't know how to maintain, land she didn't know how to work, cattle she didn't know how to find, let alone manage. Debts she couldn't pay. A future that seemed designed to destroy her. She should have felt terrified. Should have been planning her return to Westcliff tomorrow, ready to sign whatever papers would let her escape this beautiful, impossible trap. Instead, Eleanor walked to the trunk in the bedroom and opened it carefully. Inside, beneath folded blankets and what looked like winter gear, she found the rifle Caleb had mentioned. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it, the cold metal and smooth wood. She had no idea how to use it, had no idea how to do any of the 1,000 things that would be required to survive here. But she had 3 months to learn. 3 months to prove she could be more than the desperate seamstress who'd fled Boston with nothing but a telegram and determination. Eleanor carried the rifle back to the main room and leaned it against the wall near the bedroom door. Then she set about making the house livable for the night, clearing dust, checking the stove, finding blankets that didn't smell of mice. Basic tasks. Familiar tasks, things she could accomplish even while her mind raced with everything Caleb had shown her today. The work was good. It kept her hands busy while her thoughts tried to organize themselves into something resembling a plan. She couldn't manage 2,000 acres alone. Couldn't round up cattle she couldn't find or sell them at markets she didn't know how to reach. Couldn't pay debts without income she couldn't generate. But Caleb had said if she worked hard enough, learned fast enough, got lucky enough, maybe. Just maybe. Eleanor pumped water from the kitchen sink and set it to boil on the stove. While it heated, she found coffee in the supplies Henderson had provided and measured it carefully. When the water boiled, she made coffee the way her mother had taught her years ago, the familiar ritual grounding her in a place that felt like another world. She carried the cup to the porch and sat on the steps in the darkness. The coffee was bitter and strong. The night was cold despite the warm day. The stars were impossible, thousands of them, scattered across a sky that seemed close enough to touch. Somewhere out there in the darkness, cattle that belonged to her wandered through grass that belonged to her on land that belonged to her. Everything she could see and much she couldn't, all of it hers by accident of inheritance and death. The impossibility of it should have crushed her. Instead, sitting on that porch in the darkness, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Hope seemed too fragile for what she was facing, but possibility. The possibility that she might build something here, that she might become someone different from the frightened seamstress who'd boarded a westbound train 3 weeks ago. The possibility of a future that didn't involve slow starvation in a Boston boarding house. Eleanor finished her coffee and stood, her back aching from the long wagon ride, her mind exhausted from trying to absorb everything she'd learned today. Inside, the house waited. Empty but not unwelcoming, dust-covered but solid, built by a man who'd tried to make a life here even when that life fell apart. She extinguished the lamp, found her way to the bedroom in darkness, and lay down on the mattress that would need to be replaced. Through the window, she could see those impossible stars burning in their thousands. Sleep came slowly, broken by sounds she didn't recognize. Wind, animals, the settling of wood in the cooling night. But when it finally arrived, Eleanor Brooks slept in her own house on her own land for the first time in her life. And when morning came with light spilling golden across the wet mountain valley, she would wake to face the choice that would define everything that followed: surrender or fight, safety or risk, the known past or the impossible future. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when Eleanor woke to a future she still didn't understand but was beginning, despite all logic, to choose. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to cover and the sound of someone chopping wood outside. She sat up too quickly, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar sounds, the reality of where she was crashing over her like cold water. The chopping stopped. Footsteps on the porch, then a knock that was more courtesy than request. "Miss Brooks, you decent?" "Caleb." Eleanor looked down at herself, still fully dressed in yesterday's clothes, having been too exhausted to even consider changing. "Come in." He entered carrying an armload of firewood, took in her disheveled appearance, and the untouched blankets with an expression that suggested he'd expected exactly this. "Figured you'd need wood for the stove. Pile out back's mostly rotted through, but I brought some for my wagon." "What time is it?" "Near 7. Sun's been up an hour." He moved to the kitchen, began stacking wood beside the stove with practiced efficiency. "Coffee's not made. Stove's cold. You eat anything since yesterday?" Eleanor stood, smoothing her wrinkled skirt uselessly. "I had coffee last night." "That's not eating." He finished with the wood and turned to face her fully. "You spend the night thinking about whether you're staying or going?" "I'm staying." The words came out before she'd consciously decided to say them, but once spoken, Eleanor knew they were true. She'd lain awake for hours in the darkness, cataloging every reason this was impossible, every sensible argument for returning to Westcliff and signing papers that would make someone else's problem what had been Uncle Samuel's dream. But with dawn had come a stubborn clarity. Going back meant admitting defeat before she'd even tried. Staying meant at least fighting for something, even if that fight ended in failure. Caleb studied her for a long moment. "You understand what you're committing to? This isn't going to be learning some genteel skill over tea and pleasant conversation. This is going to break your back and blister your hands and make you question every decision that brought you here." "I understand." "Do you? Because I don't think you do." "Not really." He moved to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat like he was settling in for a conversation that needed sitting. "Let me tell you what staying looks like, Miss Brooks. You've got 3 months to prove you can manage this property, or the county takes it for taxes and debt. That means you need to locate your herd, execute a roundup, and get cattle to market in Denver before first snow. You need to repair fences, maintain buildings, manage water rights, and prepare for winter. You need to do all this with no crew, no capital, and no experience. You said you'd think about helping me. I did think about it. Thought about it most of the ride back to my place last night, and all the way here this morning." He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed. "Here's what I'm willing to offer, and it's the only offer you're going to get. I'll teach you what you need to know to run this ranch. I'll show you how to ride, rope, brand, manage cattle. I'll help you execute the roundup this fall. I'll provide access to equipment you don't have and connections to buyers you haven't met." Hope flared in Eleanor's chest, bright and painful. "But," Caleb continued, his voice hardening, "in exchange, you work. Not like you think work means, needle and thread and sitting in a comfortable room. I mean real work. Fence repair, hay cutting, barn mucking, every dirty, exhausting task that goes into keeping a ranch operational. You work on my place when I need an extra hand, which is going to be often. You keep up with me, no complaints, no excuses about being a woman or city-bred or tired. You fall behind, you whine, you prove you can't handle it, the deal ends, and I walk away. Understood?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "Understood. I mean it, Miss Brooks. I've got no patience for teaching someone who isn't going to put in the effort. This valley's full of people who came west with big dreams and bigger egos, thought the land would bend to their will because they wanted it bad enough. Most of them are dead or gone now. The ones who survived learned that wanting something isn't enough. You have to earn it every single day. I'm prepared to earn it. We'll see." He stood, moved to the stove, and began working with the ease of someone who'd started 1,000 cook fires. "First lesson starts now. Get over here and watch. You need to know how to work this stove because you'll be using it every day for the rest of your time here." Eleanor crossed to the kitchen, stood beside him as he showed her the sequence, clearing the firebox of old ash, arranging kindling just so, the trick of getting the flue open enough to draw without losing all the heat. His hands moved with casual competence while he explained each step, expecting her to remember without repetition. "Now you do it," he said, stepping back. Eleanor's first attempt resulted in smoke billowing into the kitchen. Her second got the fire started but too hot, wasting wood. The third finally produced the steady, controlled burn Caleb had demonstrated. "Better," he said. "You'll do that every morning until it's automatic. Can't run a ranch if you can't cook your own food." He pulled supplies from the bag he'd brought: bacon, eggs, flour. "You know how to make biscuits?" "Yes?" "Then make them while I handle the rest. We're going to eat a real breakfast. Then I'm going to work you harder than you've been worked in your entire life. By sundown, you'll either be ready to quit or ready to learn more. Either way, we'll know where we stand." They ate at the table Eleanor had dusted the night before. Simple food that tasted better than anything she remembered from Boston. Caleb ate with the focused intensity of someone for whom meals were fuel, not pleasure. Eleanor tried to match his pace and failed, her stomach still adjusting to the altitude and the reality of her situation. "Finish all of it," Caleb said when he noticed her slowing. "You're going to need the energy." After breakfast, he led her to the barn. In daylight, she could see details she'd missed yesterday. The solid construction, the stalls that had once housed more horses than the 3 remaining, the tack room with saddles and equipment she didn't recognize. Caleb moved to one of the stalls and brought out a horse, a brown mare with a white blaze down her face. "This is Sage. She belonged to your uncle, gentle enough for a beginner. You're going to learn to saddle her." For the next hour, Eleanor fumbled with equipment that seemed designed to humiliate her. The saddle weighed more than she'd expected, the girth strap refused to cooperate, and Sage, apparently sensing Eleanor's incompetence, shifted at exactly the wrong moments. Caleb watched without offering help beyond terse corrections. "Tighter. That girth's loose enough she'll roll the saddle first time you mount. The stirrup's twisted. Fix it before you try again." "Your hands are shaking. The horse feels that. Breathe and try again." By the time Eleanor finally had the saddle properly secured, her arms ached and sweat dampened her dress despite the cool morning. Caleb inspected her work with the critical eye of someone who'd spent decades doing this correctly. "Good enough. Now mount up." Eleanor stared at the stirrup that suddenly seemed impossibly high. "How do I—" "Left foot in the stirrup, grab the horn, pull yourself up, and swing your right leg over. Your skirt's going to make it harder, but you'll manage." She didn't manage. Not on the first attempt, or the second. On the third try, she got her foot in the stirrup and hauled herself up with all her strength, swinging her leg over just as Sage shifted slightly. Eleanor landed in the saddle hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. "That's one way to do it," Caleb said dryly. He showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit properly, the basic commands for walk and stop. "We're not going far today, just around the property. I want you to get a feel for being mounted before we do anything more complicated." They rode the perimeter of the ranch at a walk that felt terrifyingly fast to Eleanor. Every movement of the horse beneath her seemed designed to unseat her. Every slight change in direction required adjustments she didn't know how to make. Caleb rode beside her on his own horse, offering corrections in that same economical style. "Heels down, back straight. Don't pull on her mouth, just guide. Relax your legs. You're gripping like she's going to bolt, which just makes her nervous. Eyes up. Look where you're going, not at the ground." They rode for 2 hours. By the time Caleb finally led them back to the barn, Eleanor's legs trembled with fatigue and her back screamed from maintaining position she wasn't used to. Dismounting proved even harder than mounting. She practically fell from the saddle, stumbling when her feet hit the ground. "Unsaddle her, cool her down, then we'll move to the next task." Eleanor wanted to collapse, wanted to admit she'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, she forced her shaking hands to undo the girth, lift the saddle free, begin the process of caring for an animal whose needs she barely understood. Caleb watched for a moment, then nodded. "You'll get faster with practice. For now, just make sure it's done right." The next task was fence repair. Caleb led her to a section where rails had fallen, showed her how to reset posts that had worked loose, how to secure rails that would hold against cattle and weather. The work required strength Eleanor didn't possess, driving posts into hard ground, lifting rails that weighed more than they looked, securing everything with an accuracy that seemed impossible when her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Use your legs, not your back," Caleb said when she struggled to lift a rail. "You'll hurt yourself doing it that way." Eleanor tried again, attempting to follow his instruction. The rail rose slightly higher before her grip failed, and it crashed back to the ground. "Again!" She tried again, failed again. Again. On the 5th attempt, she got the rail into position. Caleb secured it while she stood gasping, her dress soaked with sweat despite the cool temperature. "That's one section. Got about 300 yards of fence line needs repair before winter." 300 yards. Eleanor looked at the endless line of fence stretching across the property and felt despair settle over her like a weight. "Don't think about all of it," Caleb said, apparently reading her expression. "Think about the next rail. Then the one after that. You try to hold the whole job in your head at once. You'll quit before you start." They worked through midday without stopping for lunch. Eleanor's hands blistered, her back screamed, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. But she didn't stop. Didn't ask for rest. Didn't complain. Caleb noticed. She could tell by the way his corrections became slightly less harsh, his demonstrations slightly more detailed. He didn't praise her work, but he stopped watching her quite so critically, as if she'd proven some small thing worth acknowledging. When the sun reached its peak, he finally called a halt. "That's enough for now. We'll break for food, then I've got work at my own place that needs attention. You'll use the rest of today to practice saddling Sage, riding her around the property, getting comfortable being mounted. Tomorrow morning I'll be back and we'll start on cattle work." Eleanor nodded, too exhausted for words. Caleb studied her for a moment. "You did better than I expected, Miss Brooks. Still not good, but better than I expected. Your hands are blistered?" She looked down at her palms, seeing blood where blisters had broken. "Yes." "Clean them well tonight. Wrap them if you have cloth. They'll toughen up eventually, but infected hands will make everything harder." He moved toward his horse, then paused. "One more thing. Stop wearing dresses for ranch work. You've got pants in that trunk your uncle left?" "I don't know." "Check tonight. If not, you'll need to acquire some. Can't ride properly or work fences in skirts. This isn't Boston. Nobody out here cares what you wear so long as you get the job done." He rode away without waiting for response, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard of a ranch she still didn't know how to manage, exhausted beyond anything she'd experienced, and somehow still standing. She made her way back to the house, pumped water from the sink, and scrubbed her bleeding hands as thoroughly as she could manage. The water turned pink, then clear. The pain was sharp and immediate, cutting through the general exhaustion. In the bedroom, she opened the trunk Caleb had mentioned. Inside, beneath blankets and winter gear, she found men's clothing, work pants, flannel shirts, a heavy coat. Uncle Samuel's clothes, unworn since his death. Eleanor lifted a pair of pants, held them against herself. They'd be too large, but she could make them work. The thought of wearing men's clothing would have scandalized her back in Boston. Out here, with blistered hands and aching muscles and 3 months to prove she deserved to keep breathing, scandal seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. Eleanor changed into the pants and a shirt, rolling the cuffs, cinching the waist with a belt she found in the trunk. The fabric felt strange against her skin, liberating and uncomfortable at once. She caught her reflection in a small mirror on the washstand and barely recognized herself. Hair loose and tangled, face sunburned, dressed like a man, standing in a house in the middle of nowhere. She looked nothing like the Boston seamstress who'd boarded a westbound train. For the first time since arriving, Eleanor smiled. Not from happiness, exactly, but from the fierce satisfaction of having survived a day that should have broken her. The afternoon passed in practice that was only slightly less exhausting than the morning's work. Eleanor saddled and unsaddled Sage until the process became smoother, rode slow circuits around the property until sitting in the saddle felt marginally less foreign. The mare seemed to sense Eleanor's inexperience but tolerated it with patient resignation, as if she'd trained novice riders before. By evening, Eleanor could barely move. She heated water on the stove, attempted to wash away the day's accumulated dirt and sweat, and made a simple dinner from the supplies Henderson had provided. The food sat heavy in her stomach, her body too exhausted to properly digest. She tried to stay awake, to review everything Caleb had taught her, to plan for tomorrow's lessons. Instead, she fell asleep at the table, head pillowed on her arms, and didn't wake until dawn light streamed through the windows again. The second day was harder. Her muscles had stiffened overnight, protesting every movement. Caleb arrived early, took one look at her stiff gait, and shook his head. "You stretched this morning?" "I don't know how." He showed her, methodical movements designed to loosen muscles traumatized by yesterday's work. Eleanor followed his example, feeling slight relief as her body reluctantly responded. "This is going to be worse before it gets better," Caleb said. "Your body's not used to this kind of work. It'll adapt, but adaptation hurts. You need to quit? No? Then let's get started." Today's lesson focused on cattle. Caleb brought 2 steers from his own herd, drove them into Eleanor's corral, and proceeded to teach her the basics of working livestock. How to approach without spooking them, how to read their body language, how to position herself to encourage movement in the desired direction. The steers, sensing her incompetence, ignored her completely. They moved when Caleb gestured, stopped when he commanded, and treated Eleanor like she was furniture. "They don't respect you," Caleb said. "You're moving like you're afraid of them. They sense that." "I am afraid of them. They're enormous. They're half-grown steers, barely 600 pounds. Wait until you're working with full-grown bulls that weigh twice that." He demonstrated again, his movements confident and economical. The steers responded immediately. "You need to believe you belong here. Act like you have authority even when you don't feel it. They'll follow confidence." Eleanor tried again, forcing herself to move with certainty she didn't possess. The steers shifted slightly, not quite obeying, but at least acknowledging her presence. "Better," Caleb said. Again. They worked through the morning, Eleanor learning through repetition that felt endless. How to drive cattle from one area to another, how to separate one from the group, how to recognize signs of illness or injury. Each lesson revealed new depths to her ignorance, new skills she'd need to master before the fall roundup. At midday, Caleb called another halt. "You're learning, but you're thinking too much. Cattle work is about reaction, not analysis. You need to trust your instincts." "I don't have instincts for this." "Then you'll develop them. Same as you'd develop any skill. Practice until it becomes automatic." He wiped sweat from his face with a bandana, studying her with that assessing gaze. "How are your hands?" Eleanor showed him her palms, where yesterday's blisters had been joined by new ones. The wrappings she'd applied that morning were already blood-stained. Caleb took her hands in his, turning them to examine the damage with surprisingly gentle efficiency. His own hands were calloused beyond anything Eleanor had ever seen, rough as tree bark against her torn skin. "These are going to get infected if you're not careful," he said. "You've got salve in that house?" "I don't know." "Of course not." He released her hands, moved to his saddlebag, and retrieved a small tin. "This is bag balm. Ranchers use it on cattle, but it works on people too. Clean your hands tonight, apply this thick, wrap them in clean cloth. Do that every night until they start to callus properly. Eleanor took the tin, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Caleb pulled back immediately, as if the contact had been inadvertent and unwelcome. Thank you. He nodded curtly. Can't have you losing use of your hands. You'll need them for what comes next. What came next was rope work. Caleb produced a lasso from his saddle, demonstrated the basic throw with fluid precision, then handed the rope to Eleanor. This is going to take you weeks to learn properly, maybe months, but you need to start now if you're going to be any use during roundup. Eleanor's first attempt tangled the rope around her own legs. Her second sent the loop flying in completely the wrong direction. The third hit the fence post Caleb had designated as target, but without the force or accuracy needed to actually catch anything. Again. She tried again, failed again. Again. By late afternoon, Eleanor could occasionally hit the target, though calling it catching would be generous. Her shoulders ached from the repetitive motion, her frustration mounting with each failed attempt. That's enough for today, Caleb finally said. You'll practice on your own. 30 minutes every morning, 30 every evening. Build the muscle memory. When will I be good enough to actually use it? Depends on how hard you work at it. Some people get it in weeks, others never really master it. He coiled his own rope with practiced ease. Your uncle was decent with a lasso, not the best I've seen, but competent. Maybe it runs in families. It was the first personal thing Caleb had said about Uncle Samuel, beyond bare facts. Eleanor seized the opening. What was he like? My uncle? Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering. Stubborn, proud, maybe too proud. He came out here with dreams of building an empire, which is what every fool with ambition thinks when they first see this valley. Took him a few hard years to learn that the land doesn't care about your dreams. But he succeeded. He built this ranch. He survived. There's a difference. Caleb looked around the property, his expression unreadable. Samuel made this place work through sheer determination and a willingness to learn from people who knew better. He listened to advice, adapted when he needed to, pushed through when pushing was required. He had the temperament for it, patient with cattle, understanding that some things can't be rushed. What changed? You said he gave up after his wife died. Losing Sarah broke something in him. They'd only been married 2 years, barely had time to build what they were hoping for. When she and the baby died, Caleb shook his head. He kept working, kept the ranch operational, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Just going through motions, waiting for something he couldn't name. Eleanor thought of the house. Empty but not destroyed, maintained but not lived in. He left it to me because he had no one else. Probably, or maybe he hoped someone would come along who'd care about it the way he used to, before grief made caring too painful. Caleb mounted his horse with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Either way, it's yours now. Question is what you're going to do with it. Learn everything I can, work as hard as necessary, prove I belong here. Those are words, Miss Brooks. Proving requires action. He gathered his reins, then paused. Tomorrow we start earlier, 5 o'clock. We're going to ride out and locate what's left of your herd before they drift any farther. Bring water, food for midday, and dress warm. Gets cold in the high country where they've likely scattered. I'll be ready. Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in the bloodied hands, the exhausted posture, the determination she couldn't quite hide behind fatigue. Something shifted in his expression, too quick to identify before it disappeared. I believe you might actually mean that, he said quietly. Then he rode away, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard with a rope she couldn't use properly and a future that depended on mastering 100 skills just as difficult. That night, Eleanor cleaned her hands as instructed, applied the bag balm Caleb had provided, and wrapped them carefully. She practiced with the rope until darkness made it impossible to see the fence post, then sat on the porch eating cold biscuits and watching stars emerge. The work was brutal. Her body screamed protest at every movement. She'd learned more in 2 days than in months of seamstress training, and all it had taught her was how much more she needed to know. But she'd survived 2 days, had shown Caleb and herself that she wouldn't quit at the first sign of difficulty. Tomorrow they'd search for cattle she didn't know how to manage, on land she didn't know how to navigate, using skills she'd barely begun to acquire. Eleanor finished her biscuits, went inside, and laid out Uncle Samuel's warmest coat for tomorrow's early start. Her hands throbbed despite the salve. Her muscles would hurt worse tomorrow than they did tonight. She smiled in the darkness, fierce and determined, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone too exhausted for doubt. When Caleb arrived at 5 the next morning, Eleanor was already dressed, Sage saddled with only minor fumbling, waiting in the yard with supplies packed as instructed. He looked at her, looked at the horse, looked back at her. "You ready for this?" Eleanor mounted without assistance, settling into the saddle with only slight awkwardness. Her hands hurt holding the reins. Her legs protested being in riding position again. None of it mattered. "I'm ready," Caleb almost smiled. "Then let's go find your inheritance and see if it's worth keeping." They rode east toward the rising sun, into high country where Eleanor's cattle had scattered in the months since Uncle Samuel's death, and Eleanor Brooks learned that surviving the first 2 days had been the easy part. The real test, the test that would determine everything, was only just beginning. They rode for 3 hours into country that grew progressively wilder, the grassland giving way to rocky terrain scattered with pine and juniper. Caleb led without speaking, his attention fixed on reading signs Eleanor couldn't see. Disturbed ground, broken branches, patterns in the landscape that told him where cattle had passed. Eleanor focused on staying mounted. The trail climbed steadily, Sage picking her way over rocks and fallen timber with sure-footed caution that Eleanor desperately tried not to interfere with. Her thighs ached from gripping the saddle, her hands stiff on the reins despite the wrappings protecting her blisters. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air. Around them, the valley spread out in vast sweeps of green and gold, the Sangre de Cristo range rising to the west like a wall of stone and snow. It was beautiful in a way that made Eleanor's chest tight, too big, too wild, too indifferent to human presence. Caleb finally reined in near a creek running cold and clear over smooth stones. He dismounted, let his horse drink, and gestured for Eleanor to do the same. "We'll rest here, eat something. Then we push higher to the summer meadows where your herd's likely concentrated." Eleanor dismounted with difficulty, her legs nearly buckling when they took her weight. She steadied herself against Sage's shoulder, letting the mare drink while she tried to force circulation back into protesting muscles. Caleb pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, offered her portions. They ate standing, the food tough and tasteless but necessary fuel. Eleanor drank from the creek, the water so cold it hurt her teeth, shockingly pure after Boston's metallic well water. "How much farther?" she asked. 2 miles, maybe 3. Depends on where they've settled. Caleb studied the terrain above them, his expression thoughtful. "Weather's been good this spring, lots of grass in the high meadows. They've got no reason to come down lower until we drive them." "How do we know they're ours?" "You said cattle, from different ranches mixed together." "Brands. Your uncle's broken S is registered, legally his. Any animal carrying that mark belongs to your estate, wherever it's wandered." He finished his water, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "But claiming ownership and actually controlling them are different things. During roundup, we'll separate out what's yours, drive them back to your range, prepare them for market or winter depending on age and condition. And if I can't control them, then you lose them. Simple as that. Cattle that can't be managed become someone else's problem, someone else's profit." He moved to his horse, checked the girth with practiced efficiency. "That's why we're here today. You need to see what you're working with, understand the scope of what faces you come fall." They mounted again and continued climbing. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file through terrain that made Eleanor acutely aware of the drop-offs to either side. Sage navigated with calm competence, but Eleanor's heart hammered every time loose rock shifted under the mare's hooves. Caleb glanced back once, saw her white-knuckled grip on the saddle horn. "Trust your horse. She's done this trail 100 times. You tensing up just makes it harder for both of you." Eleanor tried to relax, tried to breathe through the fear of heights she hadn't known she possessed. The trail climbed higher, the air thinning, her lungs working harder for each breath. Then they crested a ridge, and Eleanor forgot about fear entirely. The meadow spread before them like something from a painting. Acres of deep grass dotted with wildflowers, a stream cutting silver through the middle, pine forest rising on 3 sides, and the vast sweep of the valley falling away on the 4th. And scattered across that impossible beauty, cattle, dozens of them, maybe more, brown and black and red, some with calves at their sides, grazing peacefully in mountain sunshine. Most bore the broken S brand on their flanks, visible even at this distance. "There's your inheritance," Caleb said quietly. "What's left of it, anyway? I count maybe 60 head at first glance, possibly more in the trees. Add in whatever's scattered elsewhere in the valley, you're probably looking at 80 to 100 animals total. Less than your uncle ran at his peak, but enough to work with if you can bring them to market." Eleanor stared at the cattle, trying to reconcile the peaceful scene before her with the brutal economics Henderson had outlined. 80 animals at roughly $50 per head meant $4,000 gross, minus the costs of roundup and drive, against debts totaling over $1,300. The math worked. Barely. If everything went perfectly. If she could execute a successful roundup with skills she didn't possess. If the drive to Denver went smoothly. If market prices held. If a dozen other variables aligned in her favor. "It's not enough, is it?" she said. "Even if I do everything right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "It's enough to clear your debts and keep the property through winter. What you do after that, whether you rebuild the herd or sell out, that's a longer question. But it's possible. To survive this year, at least. Possible isn't the same as probable, Miss Brooks. But yes, with help, with luck, with work that's going to test everything you've got, it's possible." They sat their horses on that ridge, looking down at cattle that represented Eleanor's entire future, and she felt the weight of impossibility settle over her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd spent 2 days learning basics so rudimentary a child could master them, and now faced the reality of turning that fragmentary knowledge into survival. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we go down there and you practice what I've been teaching you. See how close you can get before they spook, read their movement patterns, start understanding how they think." Caleb gathered his reins. "And we count them properly. Can't plan a roundup without knowing exactly what we're working with." They descended into the meadow, the cattle watching their approach with mild interest. As they drew closer, Eleanor could see details: the calves nursing, the dominant cows claiming the best grazing, the young steers testing each other in mock battles. It looked peaceful, pastoral, nothing like the dangerous unpredictability Caleb had described. Then one of the cows bellowed, a sound that carried across the meadow like a warning, and the entire herd shifted. Not running, not yet, but alert and ready to move if threat materialized. "Easy," Caleb said quietly. "Walk your horse slow, no sudden movements. Let them get used to our presence." They rode the perimeter of the herd, Caleb pointing out individuals. The older cows who'd survived multiple winters, the younger stock who'd never been handled by humans, the calves who'd need branding before fall. He counted methodically, keeping mental tally of age, sex, and condition. Eleanor tried to do the same, but the cattle all looked identical to her untrained eye. She couldn't tell a 2-year-old from a 5-year-old, couldn't judge which animals were healthy and which showed signs of illness or injury. "That one," Caleb said, pointing to a cow standing slightly apart from the others. "See how she's favoring her left rear leg? Probably stepped wrong on the rocky trail up here, might have an abscess forming. We'll need to rope her during roundup, check it properly, treat it if necessary, or cull her if she's too damaged to recover." Eleanor saw the cow but couldn't detect the subtle lameness Caleb identified so easily. Another skill to add to the endless list of things she needed to learn. They worked through midday, circling the herd, identifying individuals, making notes in the small book Caleb carried. The sun climbed high and hot, burning Eleanor's face despite the altitude's cool air. She drank from her canteen, rationing water she wasn't sure how to refill. "Creek's good for drinking," Caleb said when he noticed her hesitation. "That high up, running that fast, it's clean enough." They refilled their canteens, ate more of the jerky and hardtack that constituted trail food. Eleanor sat on a rock near the stream, watching the cattle graze, trying to imagine actually controlling them. Driving them down from this high meadow, across miles of open range to corrals where they could be sorted and prepared for market. It seemed impossible. Everything seemed impossible. "You're thinking too hard again," Caleb said. He sat nearby, hat pushed back, face tilted to catch the sun. "I can see it on your face." cataloging every way this could fail. Shouldn't I be thinking about that? Understanding the risks? Understanding risks is different from drowning in them. You want to survive out here, you need to learn to focus on the next task, not the whole impossible chain of tasks stretching to the horizon. He stood, dusted off his pants. Right now, the next task is getting back down that mountain before dark. Tomorrow's task will be different. String enough todays together, eventually you reach fall and roundup, and find out if all this work meant anything. Eleanor stood too, her body protesting movement after even brief rest. And if it doesn't? If I fail despite everything? Then at least you'll fail knowing you tried. That's worth something. He moved to his horse, swung into the saddle with enviable ease. But you haven't failed yet, Miss Brooks. You're still here, still working, still asking questions instead of making excuses. That counts for more than you know. They rode down from the meadow as afternoon shadows lengthened, the trail somehow more treacherous in descent than climb. Eleanor's legs shook with exhaustion, her hands cramping on the reins, her whole body screaming for rest she couldn't afford to take. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun hung low over the western peaks, and thunderheads were building to the north. Caleb studied the darkening sky with an expression Eleanor had learned to recognize as concern. "Storm coming," he said. "Probably hit after midnight. You know how to secure your property against high winds?" "No." "Of course not." He changed direction, heading toward Eleanor's ranch instead of his own. "I'll show you. Can't have your barn roof tearing loose the first time real weather rolls through." At the ranch, Caleb led her through preparations Eleanor would never have thought to make, securing loose tools and equipment that could become projectiles in high wind, checking that barn doors and window shutters could be properly fastened, ensuring the livestock had access to shelter and wouldn't panic when thunder started. "Storm like what's building can drop hail the size of your fist," he explained as they worked. "Seen it kill cattle caught in open range, no shelter to run to. Your animals here in the corral should be fine in the barn, but you need to get them in before the storm hits properly. How do I know when that will be? You watch the sky. Wind shifts to the north, temperature drops fast, that greenish tint to the clouds. That's your warning. 15 minutes, maybe 30, before it hits hard." They finished preparations as the last sunlight faded. The air had turned heavy, pressing down with the weight of coming weather. Caleb stood in the yard, studying the northern horizon where lightning flickered inside cloud banks that looked solid as mountains. "I should head back to my place, secure my own operation," he said. "You'll be all right here alone?" Eleanor looked at the approaching storm. At the ranch, she barely knew how to maintain. At the night falling fast and dark. "I'll manage." Caleb held her gaze for a moment. "If it gets bad, I mean really bad, dangerous bad, get yourself to the cellar. That stone root cellar behind the house, it'll protect you if winds turn serious." "What about the animals?" "Animals are hardy, they'll survive. You're the one I'm worried about." He mounted his horse, then paused. "You did good today, Miss Brooks. Better than I expected when I met you in Westcliff. Still not good enough to manage this place alone, but better." It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered. Eleanor felt absurd warmth at the grudging approval. "Thank you. For teaching me. For helping when you had no obligation to do so." "Don't thank me yet. Teaching's the easy part. Living through what you've learned, that's where things get complicated." He touched his hat brim in that gesture she was learning meant goodbye. "I'll be by tomorrow if the storm doesn't do too much damage. We'll continue your education." Then he rode into the gathering darkness, and Eleanor was alone with the approaching storm and a ranch that depended on her to protect it. She worked through the evening, double-checking everything Caleb had shown her, trying to remember the sequence of preparations. The 3 horses went into the barn, along with feed and water to last them through the night. Tools secured, shutters fastened, loose items brought inside or tied down. By the time Eleanor finished, the wind had picked up, gusting hard enough to rattle the barn walls. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, the heavy air turning sharp and electric. To the north, lightning spider-webbed across clouds that blotted out the stars, and thunder rumbled like artillery in the distance. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the storm approach with fascination and growing fear. Weather in Boston had been rain and occasionally snow, manageable and predictable. This looked biblical, apocalyptic, the sky itself at war. The first drops hit like thrown pebbles, fat and cold and scattered. Then the wind shifted, the temperature plummeted further, and the rain came in sheets. Eleanor retreated inside, barred the door, lit a lamp with shaking hands. Through the windows she could see nothing but darkness and water, the world reduced to the small circle of lamplight, and the sound of rain hammering the roof like drumbeats. Thunder cracked close enough to shake the walls. Lightning turned the darkness into brief, stark daylight. Eleanor sat at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she'd made more for the comfort of routine than any desire for caffeine, and tried not to think about what would happen if the roof failed, or the barn collapsed, or any of a dozen disasters that suddenly seemed inevitable. The storm intensified. Wind screamed around the house, finding every gap and crack, rattling shutters despite their fastening. Something heavy slammed into the barn with a crash Eleanor felt through the floor. She stood, moved to the door, peered through the small window into darkness occasionally illuminated by lightning. In those brief flashes, she saw the barn still standing, shutters holding, the yard transformed into a shallow lake as rain overwhelmed the earth's ability to absorb it. Everything she'd secured seemed to be maintaining. Everything except... Lightning flashed again, and Eleanor saw it. The corral gate had torn loose, swinging wild on one hinge, and the cattle, the 3 young steers Caleb had brought for her practice, were out. Panicked by thunder, spooked by lightning, running loose in the storm toward open range where they could scatter and disappear into thousands of acres of darkness. Eleanor grabbed her coat, the one from Uncle Samuel's trunk that was too large but warm, and threw open the door before she could reconsider the foolishness of what she was about to do. Rain hit her like a physical blow, soaking through the coat instantly. Wind tore at her, strong enough she had to brace against it. She couldn't see the cattle anymore, couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. But she knew roughly which direction they'd run, knew that if they made it to open range, she'd never find them again without help she couldn't ask for. Eleanor ran into the storm. The yard was a swamp, sucking at her boots with every step. Rain blinded her, wind deafened her, but she pushed forward, one hand outstretched, trying to navigate by memory toward where the fence line should be. Lightning showed her the steers, dark shapes moving fast, heads down, running from the terror of thunder toward whatever safety instinct promised. They were already past the fence line, already in the grassland beyond. Eleanor ran faster, her lungs burning, legs churning through mud and water. She had no rope, no plan beyond the desperate need to stop them before they disappeared entirely. She shouted, knowing they couldn't hear her over the storm, knowing it was futile but shouting anyway. One of the steers veered in her direction, confused by her sudden appearance. Eleanor changed course to intercept, throwing her arms wide, making herself as large as possible. The steer hesitated, turned, and Eleanor seized the moment to drive it back toward the corral, toward home. Except she'd lost her bearings in the darkness. She had no idea which direction the corral actually was. Lightning flashed, and she saw the barn impossibly far to her left. She'd been driving the steer completely wrong, herding it deeper into open range instead of back to safety. Eleanor changed direction, moving to circle around the steer, using her body to turn it back toward the buildings. The animal resisted, frightened and stubborn, ducking away from her attempts at control. "Please," Eleanor gasped, knowing the word meant nothing to an animal but unable to stop herself. "Please, just go back." Thunder exploded overhead, close enough she felt it in her chest. The steer bolted and Eleanor bolted after it, running blind through rain and darkness, feet slipping on wet grass, arms outstretched like she could somehow catch 600 pounds of panicked cattle with her bare hands. She went down hard, hitting the ground with force that knocked the air from her lungs. Mud filled her mouth, her eyes, covered her hands as she tried to push herself up. Rain pounded her back, wind screamed over her, and for a moment Eleanor considered just staying down, just surrendering to the storm and the impossible task, and the reality that she was failing at everything she'd tried to do. Then hands grabbed her shoulders, hauling her upright with strength she didn't possess. Caleb's face appeared in lightning flash, his expression grim, water pouring from his hat brim. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he shouted over the storm. "The cattle got out. The gate broke and they're running, and I couldn't—" "I know. I saw them from my place." He kept one hand on her arm, steadying her against the wind. "Get back to the house. I'll get the steers." "I can help." "You're going to get yourself killed. Get inside now." But Eleanor pulled free from his grip, standing her ground in the storm. "They're my cattle, my responsibility. Tell me what to do." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, rain streaming between them, lightning illuminating the calculation in his eyes. Then he nodded sharply. "Stay with me. Move when I move. We're going to circle around, cut them off from open range, drive them back as a group." He grabbed her hand, his grip iron strong. "Don't let go. You get separated in this. You'll wander into a ravine and break your neck." They ran together through the storm, Caleb somehow navigating by instinct through darkness and rain. Eleanor held tight to his hand, trusting him completely because she had no other choice, her boots slipping and sliding, but his strength keeping her upright. He led her wide to the east, then turned north, counting on the cattle to follow fence lines they couldn't see but might sense. The steers materialized out of the darkness, huddled together now, their panic subsiding into miserable acceptance of the weather. "Spread wide," Caleb shouted. "Make yourself big. We're going to push them slow and steady back toward the barn." Eleanor released his hand and moved to the left, arms spread, walking toward the cattle with what she hoped looked like confidence. The steers shifted, uncertain, then began moving in the right direction, away from open range, toward home. They walked through the storm for what felt like hours, but was probably 15 minutes. Eleanor matched Caleb's pace, adjusting her position when the steers tried to veer off course, maintaining pressure that kept them moving without panicking them into another run. Lightning showed the barn ahead, the corral with its broken gate. Safety. Impossibly close now. The steers saw it too, seemed to recognize shelter, and broke into a trot toward the barn. Caleb ran ahead, throwing open the barn door, and the animals surged inside, driven by instinct to escape the storm. Eleanor stumbled in behind them, Caleb catching her as she nearly fell again. He slammed the door shut, dropped the bar into place, and they stood in darkness filled with the sound of rain on the roof and frightened animals settling into straw. "You got a lamp?" Caleb asked. Eleanor fumbled in the darkness, finding the lantern she'd hung near the door that morning. Caleb struck a match, his hand somehow still steady despite the cold and wet, and lit the wick. Warm light filled the barn, showing them both soaked to the bone, covered in mud, shaking with exhaustion and cold. "You're insane," Caleb said, but there was something other than anger in his voice. "Running out into a storm like that for 3 steers who probably weren't even yours to begin with." "I thought they were mine. You brought them for practice." "They were practice animals, Miss Brooks. I would have brought them back to my place tomorrow, none the worse for spending a night in open range." He pushed wet hair back from his face, water streaming from his coat. "You risked your life for borrowed cattle." Eleanor started shaking harder, the adrenaline draining away and leaving only the reality of what she'd done. "I didn't think. I just saw them running and I couldn't let them go." That kind of not thinking gets people killed out here. But Caleb's voice had softened slightly. He moved to check the horses, running expert hands over them to ensure the storm hadn't caused injuries. "Lucky for you, I saw the gate go from my place. Luckier still, I decided to come help instead of assuming you'd have sense enough to stay inside." "Why did you come?" He didn't answer immediately, focused on examining Sage's legs for cuts or strains. When he finally spoke, his back was still turned. "Because I've seen what you're trying to do these past few days. Seen how hard you're working, how much you're willing to suffer to make this impossible thing work. And I thought..." He paused, seemed to reconsider his words. "I thought it would be a waste if you died in a storm because you didn't know better than to chase cattle in the dark. So you came to save me." "I came to save the cattle. Saving you was incidental." But Eleanor heard the lie in it, saw the careful way he wasn't meeting her eyes. Caleb had ridden through a dangerous storm to help her, had grabbed her hand in the darkness and guided her to safety, had worked beside her to bring the steers home. The barrier between teacher and student had cracked, letting through something neither of them was ready to name. "We should get you back to the house," Caleb said, still not looking at her. "Get dry before you catch pneumonia." They ran through rain that had lessened but not stopped, Eleanor following Caleb's lead across the flooded yard. The house was exactly as she'd left it, lamp still burning on the table, coffee cold in her abandoned cup. Caleb stood dripping on the threshold, clearly uncomfortable being inside her home. "You've got dry clothes?" "Yes." "Then change. Get warm. He looked around, seemed to make a decision. "I'll get a fire going. That stove of yours is going to take work in this weather." He moved to the stove with the same competent efficiency he brought to everything, working while Eleanor retreated to the bedroom and peeled off her soaked clothing with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. She found dry pants and a shirt, thick socks, wrapped herself in a blanket because even dry she couldn't get warm. When she emerged, Caleb had a fire going and coffee heating on the stove. He'd removed his own coat but was still soaked, water pooling under his boots on her clean floor. "You should change too," Eleanor said. "There's more of my uncle's clothes in the trunk. They'd fit you better than me. I'm fine." "You're freezing and soaked through. Don't be stubborn." "I'm always stubborn, Miss Brooks. Comes with the territory." But he was shaking too. She could see it in the way his hands moved. "Besides, I should head back to my own place. Make sure the storm didn't do damage there too. In this weather, you'd never make it. The creek's probably flooded, the trails will be washed out." Eleanor moved to the trunk, pulled out dry clothes. "Stay here tonight. Sleep in the other bedroom. We'll both check our properties in the morning when we can actually see what we're doing." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but another shiver ran through him and he nodded reluctantly. "Just tonight. And only because you're right about the creek." He changed in the bedroom while Eleanor poured coffee, her hands finally steady enough to hold the pot. When he emerged in Samuel's clothes, she handed him a cup and they sat at the table, not speaking, just listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle inside. "I meant what I said," Caleb said eventually. "What you did tonight was foolish. Could have gotten you killed." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I'm not sure you understand how fast things can go wrong out here. How little margin for error exists between survival and disaster." He set down his cup, met her eyes directly. "You can't afford mistakes like that, Eleanor. Not if you're serious about keeping this place." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formal Miss Brooks. The intimacy of it felt dangerous, significant in ways she didn't want to examine. "I understand," she said quietly. "But I also understand that those cattle, practice animals or not, represented something I couldn't afford to lose. Control. Capability. Proof that I could handle the responsibility even in difficult conditions. Proof or foolishness? Maybe both, but I'd rather fail trying than succeed by not taking any risks at all." Caleb was quiet, studying her over the rim of his coffee cup. Outside, thunder rumbled, distant now, the worst of the storm passing. Rain still fell, but the apocalyptic fury had diminished to steady downpour. "Your uncle said something similar once," Caleb said. "After his first disastrous winter, when he lost half his herd and nearly lost the ranch. I told him he should sell, cut his losses, find something easier. He said he'd rather die trying to build something real than survive by settling for something safe." "What did you say to that?" "I said dying for a dream doesn't make the dream worth dying for." Caleb set down his cup. "He proved me wrong, though. Built this place into something viable, something that could have lasted if life hadn't broken his heart. So maybe I was wrong then. Maybe I'm wrong now, thinking you can't do what he did. You don't think I can succeed. I think your odds are terrible, and your timing is worse, and you're starting from a position of ignorance that would make most people quit before they started." He paused. "But I also think you've got the same stubborn determination your uncle had. The same willingness to bleed for what you want. That counts for something, even if it's not enough on its own." Eleanor wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, feeling warmth seep into fingers that had been numb with cold. "Then teach me how to make it enough. Show me what I need to do to turn determination into actual success." "That's what I've been trying to do." "I know, and I'm grateful. But tonight, working together in that storm, bringing the cattle back, that felt different than the lessons you've been giving me. That felt like partnership instead of instruction." Caleb stood abruptly, moved to the window, stared out at rain-soaked darkness. When he spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "Partnership requires equal contribution, Miss Brooks. What we did tonight was me saving you from the consequences of your inexperience. That's not partnership, that's rescue." "Is it? Because from where I stood, you needed my help to bring those steers back. You told me what to do, and I did it. We worked together. We worked together because I was worried you'd get yourself killed if I didn't." He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. Don't mistake necessity for something more than it is. But Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, heard the slight roughness in his voice that suggested his certainty wasn't as solid as his words implied. Something had changed between them in that storm, something neither was ready to acknowledge, but both felt pressing against the careful boundaries they'd established. "I should sleep," Caleb said. "We'll both need rest if we're going to assess damage come morning. Take the second bedroom. Blankets are in the trunk." He nodded, moved toward the room, then paused in the doorway. "Eleanor, what you did tonight, running into that storm, refusing to give up, working through fear to do what needed doing. That's the kind of determination that makes the difference out here, the kind your uncle had." He met her eyes. "I'm starting to think maybe you inherited more from him than just property." Then he was gone, closing the door between them, leaving Eleanor alone with the fire and her thoughts, and the steady drum of rain on the roof. She sat for a long time, too keyed up to sleep, replaying the events of the night. The terror of the storm, the desperation of chasing cattle through darkness, the solid strength of Caleb's hand in hers, guiding her home. The moment when they'd worked together to bring the steers back, moving in coordination that felt natural despite her inexperience. The way something had shifted in how he looked at her, spoke to her, treated her as more than just an obligation he'd grudgingly accepted. Eleanor cleaned the coffee cups, banked the fire, checked the windows one final time. The storm had passed, leaving only rain and wind. Tomorrow, they'd assess damage, continue her education, return to the careful distance of teacher and student. But tonight, in the aftermath of the storm, something had changed between them. Some barrier had cracked, letting through the possibility of connection beyond simple instruction. Eleanor went to bed and lay in darkness, listening to rain and knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new tests of her determination to survive. But for tonight, she'd proven something to Caleb and to herself. She could work through fear, could function in crisis, could earn, if not yet his full respect, at least his grudging acknowledgement that she might be capable of more than he'd initially believed. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The rain continued through the night, gentle now, washing away the evidence of the storm, while Eleanor slept the deep sleep of exhaustion and survival, and in the other room, Caleb lay awake wondering when protecting his neighbor's investment had become something more complicated than simple obligation. Morning came soft and clean, the storm's fury replaced by crystalline air and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Eleanor woke to silence, the kind of profound quiet that follows violence, and for a moment couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached like she'd been beaten. Then memory returned. The storm, the cattle, Caleb's hand in hers guiding her through darkness. She sat up too quickly, wincing at muscles that screamed protest, and listened for sounds from the other bedroom. Nothing. Just birdsong outside and the drip of water from the eaves. Eleanor dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons, and emerged to find the house empty. Caleb's borrowed clothes were folded neatly on the table. Her uncle's things returned with a precision that spoke of military habit or simple consideration. Through the window, she could see him in the yard, already dressed in his own dried clothing, inspecting damage with the methodical attention she'd learned to recognize. She stepped outside into morning that sparkled with yesterday's rain, everything washed clean and impossibly green. The mountains stood sharp against the sky, their peaks dusted with fresh snow that hadn't fallen in the valley. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache, this land that could kill you one night and greet you with beauty the next morning. Caleb looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Sleep well?" "Well enough. You?" "I've had worse nights." He gestured toward the corral. "Gate needs proper repair, not just the temporary fix I did at first light. Lost some shingles off the barn roof, but nothing structural. Your stock came through fine, all things considered." Eleanor looked at the damage, trying to calculate costs she couldn't afford. "How bad is it?" "Could have been worse. Storm like that. I've seen barns completely destroyed, cattle scattered across 3 counties. You got lucky." He moved toward the barn, expecting her to follow. Lucky and foolish, which is a dangerous combination out here. Are we going to talk about last night? Caleb stopped, his back to her, shoulders tense. What's there to talk about? Storm came through, we dealt with it, now we move on to today's work. We worked together. You came to help me when you had no obligation to do so. I'm your neighbor. That's obligation enough in this valley. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Don't make it into something it's not, Miss Brooks. The formal address stung after he'd used her given name the night before. Eleanor felt the barrier slamming back into place, the careful distance reasserting itself, and didn't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. Of course, she said quietly. My mistake. Something flickered across his face, regret maybe, or frustration, but it disappeared before she could identify it. We've got work to do. Storm set us back a day, which means you're a day behind on learning what you need to know. Can't afford to waste time on... He trailed off, seemed to reconsider his words. On things that don't move you closer to being ready for Roundup. They worked through the morning in careful silence, repairing storm damage and returning to the routine of lessons that had defined the past week. Caleb showed her how to properly patch roof damage, how to assess whether fence posts needed replacing or could be salvaged, how to check livestock for injuries that might have occurred during the storm's panic. Eleanor followed his instructions with mechanical precision, performing tasks without the engagement she'd felt before. Something had shifted between them in that storm, and now something else was shifting back, or trying to, and the tension of it made every interaction feel awkward and weighted. By midday, they'd finished the critical repairs. Caleb stood in the yard, studying the ranch with an assessing gaze that seemed to be calculating something Eleanor couldn't guess. You're making progress, he said finally. Slower than I'd like, but progress nonetheless. Another month of this pace, and you might be competent enough to attempt Roundup with hired help. Hired help I can't afford. There's men in the valley who'll work for percentage of the sale rather than upfront wages. Risky for them, but possible if you can convince them you're worth the gamble. He moved to his horse, began checking the saddle with hands that had performed the same action 10,000 times. I'll put word out. See who might be willing to take a chance on your operation. That's generous of you. It's practical. A failed ranch next to mine affects my property value. Helping you succeed is helping myself. The words were matter of fact, but Eleanor heard the defensive edge in them, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Still, thank you. Caleb swung into the saddle, gathered his reins, looked down at her with an expression she couldn't read. I'll be back tomorrow, same time. We'll start working on your rope skills properly. You're going to need them if you expect to catch anything during Roundup. He rode away without waiting for response, leaving Eleanor standing in the yard with mud on her boots and questions she didn't know how to ask tangling in her mind. The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Caleb arrived each morning before sunrise, worked with Eleanor until midday, teaching skills that slowly, painfully began to make sense. Her hands calloused properly, the constant blistering finally giving way to tougher skin. Her seat in the saddle improved from barely competent to marginally adequate. Her rope work progressed from embarrassing to merely poor. Most importantly, she began to understand cattle in ways that couldn't be taught through words alone. The way they moved in groups, the subtle hierarchies within the herd, the signs of distress or contentment that Caleb read so easily. She learned to approach without spooking, to drive without panicking, to see individual animals instead of an undifferentiated mass of brown and black. But while her skills improved, the careful distance Caleb maintained never quite dissolved. He was patient in his teaching, generous with his time, but always professional, always slightly remote. The moment in the storm when his guard had dropped, when he'd used her name with familiar warmth, that seemed to belong to a different person, a different relationship, something that couldn't exist in daylight. Eleanor told herself it didn't matter. She was here to learn ranching, not to develop complicated feelings for a neighbor who'd made it clear their relationship was purely transactional. But some mornings, watching him demonstrate a technique with casual grace, she found herself remembering the strength of his hand in hers, the relief she'd felt when he appeared in that storm, the way his voice had softened when he'd acknowledged her determination. She pushed the thoughts away and focused on work that never seemed to end. 3 weeks after the storm, Caleb arrived with news. Henderson's looking for you. Sent word you should come to Westcliff. Discuss estate matters. Probably wants to know your intentions regarding the property. Eleanor's stomach dropped. 3 weeks of brutal work, incremental progress, and the lawyer wanted answers she still didn't have. When? Soon as you can manage. I'll ride with you if you're ready to go today. They made the trip to Westcliff in comfortable silence. Eleanor's riding now proficient enough, she didn't need constant instruction. The town looked exactly as it had when she'd first arrived, small, temporary, indifferent to individual struggles. But Eleanor felt different riding into it now, no longer quite the desperate city woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach. Henderson greeted them in his office with the expression of a man who'd expected Eleanor to fail and was still waiting for that failure to materialize. Miss Brooks? Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming. Your message said you needed to discuss estate matters, Eleanor said, settling into the chair she'd occupied during their first meeting. Caleb remained standing near the door, present but separate. Indeed, it's been nearly a month since you took possession of the property. I need to know your intentions so I can properly advise the creditors and tax authorities. Henderson pulled out papers, arranged them with bureaucratic precision. Are you planning to sell or attempt to maintain the ranch? I'm maintaining it. Henderson's eyebrows rose. With respect, Miss Brooks, maintaining a cattle ranch requires more than good intentions. It requires capital, expertise, and resources you don't possess. I'm acquiring expertise. Mr. Mercer has been teaching me ranch management. The lawyer's gaze shifted to Caleb, clearly skeptical. And you believe she's capable of executing a successful roundup and drive this fall? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor held her breath, waiting for him to confirm what Henderson clearly expected, that she was attempting the impossible, that failure was inevitable, that she should cut her losses while she still could. I believe, Caleb said slowly, that Miss Brooks has worked harder in the past month than most people work in a year. She's learned faster than I expected, shown more determination than I thought possible, and demonstrated a willingness to do whatever's necessary to make this operation succeed. Henderson waited. But success isn't guaranteed. Storm damage set her back. She's still learning skills that should be automatic. The fall timeline is aggressive for someone with her experience level. Caleb met Eleanor's eyes across the room. However, I've agreed to help execute the roundup personally, and I believe with proper assistance, she can bring enough cattle to market to clear her debts and maintain the property through winter. Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, relief and gratitude mixing with emotions more complicated. Henderson made a note on his papers. I see. And what's your interest in this arrangement, Mr. Mercer? Seems unusually generous, helping a competitor build their operation. Miss Brooks isn't competition. Her herd's too small to affect market prices. And having a functional ranch next to mine rather than abandoned property benefits everyone in the valley. Caleb's voice was level, reasonable, giving away nothing beyond practical considerations. Practical considerations, Henderson repeated, clearly not entirely convinced, but apparently willing to accept the explanation. He turned back to Eleanor. Very well. I'll inform the creditors you are actively managing the estate and intend to settle debts from fall proceeds. However, Miss Brooks, you should understand that if you fail to bring sufficient cattle to market, or if market prices fall below current projections, you will still be liable for all outstanding debts. The property could be seized and auctioned to satisfy those obligations. I understand. Do you? Because I've seen too many people come west with dreams bigger than their bank accounts, thinking determination alone will overcome economic reality. Henderson's voice wasn't cruel, just tired. I don't want to see you destroy yourself financially attempting something that may not be achievable. Then I suppose I'd better make it achievable, Eleanor said quietly. They concluded the meeting with paperwork. Eleanor signing documents that formalized her intent to maintain the property, acknowledging debts and timelines, committing herself legally to a course of action that still terrified her in quiet moments. Walking out of Henderson's office into afternoon sunlight, Eleanor felt the weight of what she'd just done settle over her shoulders. She'd burned her bridges, committed herself completely. There was no going back now, no safety net if she failed. You all right? Caleb asked as they moved toward the horses. I just legally obligated myself to succeed at something I still barely understand how to do. I'm not sure all right is the right word. Scared? Terrified. Caleb nodded slowly. Good. Fear keeps you careful. Overconfidence kills people out here. He mounted his horse, waited while Eleanor did the same. But what you told Henderson in there about making it achievable, that's the right attitude. You can't control cattle prices or weather or a dozen other variables. You can control how hard you work and how much you're willing to learn. They rode out of Westcliff, past the hotel where Eleanor had spent that first uncertain night, past the livery where she'd first met Caleb and he'd assessed her with skeptical eyes. The valley spread before them, vast and beautiful and indifferent, and Eleanor felt a strange sense of homecoming she hadn't expected. Caleb, she said as they rode, what you said in Henderson's office about helping me with Roundup, did you mean it? I don't say things I don't mean. But it's more than you agreed to originally. More than just teaching me basics, actually participating in the Roundup, providing your time and expertise. That's significant help. He was quiet for so long Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Your uncle and I weren't friends exactly, but we were good neighbors. Helped each other through hard times, shared resources when it made sense, respected boundaries when it didn't. After Sarah died and he started withdrawing, I should have pushed harder to keep him engaged. Should have forced him to accept help when he clearly needed it. Caleb adjusted his hat. A gesture Eleanor had learned meant he was uncomfortable with the direction of conversation. I can't change what happened with Samuel, but I can make sure his niece has a fair chance at succeeding where he eventually gave up. So you're helping me to make up for not helping him. I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do, and because... He trailed off, seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. Because you've earned it. The help, I mean. You've worked hard enough to deserve someone taking a real interest in your success. Eleanor wanted to push further, to ask what he'd almost said, but something in his posture warned against it. They rode in silence until the ranch came into view, the buildings that now felt like home, even though she'd only occupied them for a month. As they approached, Eleanor saw a wagon in the yard, a woman standing on the porch like she'd been waiting. She was perhaps 50, weathered but handsome, dressed practically in clothes that had seen hard use. That's Margaret Hendricks, Caleb said. Runs the spread to your west with her 2 sons. Tough as they come, fair dealer, sharp eye for cattle. Margaret watched them approach with frank assessment. Caleb? Miss Brooks, I presume? Mrs. Hendricks. Eleanor dismounted, moved forward with hand extended. Eleanor, please. Margaret's handshake was firm, her palm as calloused as Caleb's. Heard you were attempting to run Samuel's place. Wanted to see for myself if the rumors were true. Which rumors specifically? That a city woman with no experience was crazy enough to try ranching in this valley. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Also heard you worked through that big storm 3 weeks back. Brought in scattered cattle without losing your nerve. That true? Eleanor glanced at Caleb, who shrugged. News travels in small valleys, he said. It's true, Eleanor confirmed, though I had help. Help's the difference between success and disaster out here. No shame in accepting it. Margaret gestured toward the house. Mind if we talk inside? Got a proposition you might be interested in hearing. They settled around Eleanor's table, coffee poured, the ritual of hospitality observed even in business discussions. Margaret got straight to the point. Roundup's coming in 2 months. I need extra hands to work my herd, separate what's mine from the valley mix, get them ready for the Denver drive. Caleb tells me you'll be executing your own Roundup simultaneous. That's the plan. Then here's what I'm proposing. We combine efforts, work both our herds together, share labor and resources, split the cost proportional to our respective herd sizes. My boys know cattle work. Got 3 other hands I trust. You bring your stock and whatever help you've arranged. We execute a single large roundup instead of 2 separate smaller ones, then divide the animals appropriately afterward. Eleanor tried to process the offer, understand the implications. What's the benefit to you? Your operation is already established. Why help someone who's barely functional? Because combined operations are more efficient. Because I'd rather have a competent neighbor than watch another property go abandoned and drag down valley land values. And because, Margaret paused, choosing words carefully, because women out here need to help each other. There's not many of us running our own operations. We succeed or fail together, more often than not. The offer was generous, almost suspiciously so. Eleanor looked at Caleb. What do you think? I think Margaret runs the tightest operation in the valley, and you'd be a fool to turn down her help. Also think she doesn't make offers like this without calculating the benefit to herself, so don't mistake generosity for charity. Margaret laughed, sharp and genuine. Caleb knows me too well. You're right, I'm not offering pure charity. Having someone competent on the Brooks property stabilizes the valley, makes all our holdings more valuable. Plus I get access to your water rights during combined roundup, which makes gathering stock easier. She leaned forward, her expression serious. But don't doubt that I'm also offering because I see something in you worth investing in. You could have run back east after that first week. Most people would have. Instead, you're still here, still working, still trying. That deserves support. Eleanor felt emotion tighten her throat. Gratitude and relief and the overwhelming sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing this impossible task entirely alone. I accept, she said, with thanks. Don't thank me yet. My roundup crew works hard and expects everyone to pull their weight. You'll earn every bit of help you receive. Margaret stood, drained her coffee cup. I'll be back in 6 weeks with details on timing and logistics. Meanwhile, you keep learning from Caleb here. By roundup time, I expect you to be competent enough not to slow us down. After Margaret left, Eleanor and Caleb stood in the yard watching dust settle from her wagon's departure. The sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and pink, ending another day of progress that felt simultaneously substantial and insufficient. You just gained a powerful ally, Caleb said quietly. Margaret doesn't offer partnership lightly. She sees potential in your operation. Or she sees an opportunity to acquire my property if I fail and it goes to auction. That too, probably. Margaret's a businesswoman first, but she's also fair. If she's offering help, she genuinely wants you to succeed, just not at her own expense. Eleanor turned to face him fully. And you? What do you want, Caleb? The question hung between them, weighted with meanings Eleanor wasn't sure she could articulate. What did she want him to want? For her to succeed? To stay? Something more complicated than neighborly cooperation? Caleb met her eyes, and for a moment his careful guard slipped. She saw something there. Warmth, concern, maybe the edge of feelings he'd been working hard to suppress. Then the guard slammed back into place and his voice was level again, professional. I want you to survive your first year, build something sustainable, become the kind of neighbor this valley needs. He moved toward his horse, that gesture of retreat she'd come to recognize. I'll be here tomorrow, same as always. We've lost time talking today, need to make it up with hard work tomorrow. Caleb, wait! He paused, his back to her, shoulders tense. Eleanor took a breath, forced herself to say what needed saying. I know you're trying to keep things professional between us, keep proper distance, and I understand why. You're doing me a favor, teaching me, and mixing that with personal feelings would complicate everything. Saw his shoulders tighten further. But I need you to know that I value what we're building here. Not just the ranching knowledge, but the partnership, the way we work together in that storm. I value that. Value you. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment. When he turned, his expression was carefully controlled, but his eyes were conflicted. Eleanor, I'm 15 years older than you. I've lived hard, lost people, built walls that served me well for a long time. You're young, educated, from a world I'll never understand. Once you prove you can run this ranch, once you've established yourself in the valley, you'll have options I can't provide. Shouldn't tie yourself to a weathered rancher when you could do better. Shouldn't I get to decide what's better for myself? Should you? You barely know this life, barely know me. What you're feeling, gratitude maybe, or respect for someone who's helped you, that's not the same as actual regard worth building on. Eleanor stepped closer, bridging the careful distance he maintained. Don't tell me what I'm feeling. I've spent a month working beside you, learning from you, Watching how you treat animals and land and people, I know enough to understand that what I feel is more than gratitude. You're exhausted, overwhelmed, facing impossible odds. I'm the only person who's been kind to you since you arrived. That's not a foundation for anything real. Then what would be? How much harder do I need to work? How much more do I need to prove before you'll stop dismissing what's growing between us? Caleb's control cracked, frustration breaking through. It's not about proving anything. It's about protecting you from making choices based on circumstances rather than genuine feeling. You came here desperate, alone, terrified. I helped because it was right, not to create obligation or emotional debt. When you're stable, when you've had time to think clearly without crisis driving every decision, then we can talk about what you actually want beyond survival. I want you. The words fell between them like stones in still water, rippling outward into silence. Eleanor's heart hammered, but she held his gaze, refusing to take back what she'd said. Caleb's expression shifted through emotions too fast to track: surprise, longing, resistance, resignation. When he spoke, his voice was rough. You don't know what you're asking. Don't I? I'm asking for honesty. For you to stop hiding behind excuses about age and circumstance and tell me what you actually feel. What I feel is terrified I'm taking advantage of someone vulnerable. What I feel is guilty for wanting something I shouldn't. What I feel is... He stopped, ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. I care about you, Eleanor. More than I should, more than is wise, more than is fair given our circumstances. I care about your success and your safety and your future. And that's exactly why I've been trying to maintain distance, because caring this much clouds judgment. Eleanor reached out, took his hand the way he'd taken hers in the storm. His fingers were rough, calloused, strong, and they closed around hers with a tenderness that contradicted his careful words. What if I don't want you to maintain distance? She said quietly. What if I want partnership that's more than just ranching? What if I've spent a month falling for a man who treats me like an equal, who pushes me to be better, who came riding through a storm to help me bring home 3 steers that weren't even mine? Then I'd say you're making my attempt at nobility extremely difficult, Caleb said, and despite everything there was a hint of smile in his voice. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth in the cooling evening air. Then stop trying to be noble. Just be honest. For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen, his hand tight around hers, clearly warring with himself. Then something in him surrendered, and he pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. I'm courting you, he said quietly, formally, properly, the way a woman deserves, not taking advantage of gratitude or circumstance, but offering genuine regard with time for you to be certain of your own feelings. That's what I'm proposing if you'll have it. Joy flooded through Eleanor, warm and unexpected and entirely certain. Yes. Yes? Yes, I'll have it. I'll have you, courting me properly and formally, and giving me time I don't need to be certain of feelings I'm already sure about. She smiled up at him. Though I reserve the right to tell you when I'm done being courted and ready for something more permanent. Caleb laughed, the sound rough and genuine. Fair enough. Though I'm warning you now, courting me means late nights talking about cattle prices and water rights. Romance out here looks different than what you're used to. I'm not who I used to be. The woman you're courting is a rancher, not a seamstress. She'll find romance in shared work and honest partnership just fine. He kissed her then, gentle and careful and full of a tenderness that made Eleanor's breath catch. When they finally pulled apart, the sun had set and stars were emerging in that impossibly vast sky. I should go, Caleb said, though he didn't release her hand. Give you time to think clearly about what you just agreed to. I'm thinking clearly, probably more clearly than I have since arriving here. We'll see if you still think that come morning. But he was smiling, his guard finally lowered, and the careful distance that had defined their interactions had dissolved into something warmer, more honest, infinitely more complicated. Same time tomorrow? Eleanor asked. Same time. Though now I'm courting you, I might arrive a bit earlier. Bring coffee, maybe, if that's acceptable. Very acceptable. He mounted his horse, looked down at her with an expression that was entirely new, open, warm, full of possibility. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Caleb." She watched him ride away into darkness, her hand still warm from his touch, her heart lighter than it had been since that telegram arrived in Boston. The work ahead remained brutal, the odds still terrible, the risk of failure constant and real. But now she wasn't facing it alone. Not just because of Margaret's offer or Caleb's expertise, but because somewhere between learning to saddle a horse and chasing cattle through a storm, she'd found partnership that went deeper than practicality. Eleanor returned to the house, made coffee she didn't need, and sat on the porch watching stars emerge. The ranch spread around her in darkness, buildings she was learning to maintain, land she was learning to manage, animals she was learning to control. It was hers by accident, but she was making it hers by choice, by work, by determination to build something that could last. And now maybe she was building something beyond just the ranch. Something with a man who'd seen her at her weakest and helped her become stronger, who'd offered respect before affection, partnership before romance, and was now offering both with an honesty that made her certain of feelings she'd been afraid to acknowledge. The future remained uncertain. Roundup could fail, debts could overwhelm her, a dozen disasters could destroy everything she was attempting to build. But tonight, with Caleb's kiss still warm on her lips, and the valley spread vast beneath endless stars, Eleanor Brooks felt something she hadn't felt since leaving Boston. She felt hope, real, grounded, earned hope based not on desperate wishes, but on genuine progress and honest partnership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new tests of strength she was still building. But tomorrow would also bring Caleb arriving early with coffee, Margaret's promised support for Roundup, and another day of proving that what had seemed impossible might actually be achievable. Eleanor finished her coffee, went inside, and prepared for sleep with a lightness in her chest that felt dangerously close to happiness. The inheritance she'd never wanted was becoming a home she couldn't imagine leaving. The life she'd fled was becoming a memory. The future she couldn't envision was becoming something she could almost see. Challenging, but possible. Difficult, but worth fighting for. And the man she'd hired as a teacher was becoming something infinitely more important, something worth building toward through all the hard work and uncertainty that still lay ahead. Sleep came easily that night, and with it dreams of Roundup and partnership, and a future that stretched beyond simple survival into something richer, deeper, and entirely her own. True to his word, Caleb arrived earlier the next morning, dawn barely breaking over the mountains, carrying coffee that was still hot, and a smile that transformed his weathered face into something younger, lighter. Eleanor met him on the porch, her own smile matching his, and they stood together drinking coffee and watching the valley emerge from darkness like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Ready to work?" he asked, and the question carried weight beyond simple ranch tasks. "Always." The next 6 weeks passed in a blur of brutal preparation and growing certainty. Eleanor's skills sharpened through repetition that made her muscles scream and her determination harden. She could rope competently now, hit her target more often than not, bring down a calf or steer when needed. Her riding had progressed from barely adequate to genuinely capable, Sage responding to her commands with trust earned through consistent handling. The cattle work that had seemed impossibly complex began to make sense. Reading animal behavior, anticipating movement, working with the herd instead of against it. But more than skills, Eleanor was building something deeper. Confidence grounded in actual competence rather than desperate hope. Understanding of the land's rhythms and demands. Connection to a place that had seemed foreign but was becoming, day by day, unmistakably home. And through it all, Caleb was there. Teaching, yes, but also courting with a deliberate patience that Eleanor found both frustrating and endearing. He brought her wildflowers found on his morning rides, stayed for dinner, and talked about everything from cattle prices to childhood memories to the books they'd both read. Kissed her goodnight on the porch with a tenderness that made her forget exhaustion and doubt. They worked side by side, their partnership deepening through shared effort and honest conversation. Caleb stopped hiding behind professional distance. Let her see the man beneath the careful guard, someone who'd lost people he loved, built walls to protect himself, and was now cautiously, deliberately allowing those walls to come down. "You're different than I expected," Eleanor said one evening as they sat on her porch watching sunset paint the mountains impossible colors. "Different how?" "Gentler." The first time we met, you seemed so hard, skeptical of everything, dismissive of anyone who didn't meet your standards. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I was hard. Had to be, to survive out here alone as long as I have, but you... He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her calloused palm. You reminded me that hard isn't the same as strong, that opening up to someone doesn't make you weak. Your uncle used to say something similar before he lost Sarah. Said isolation was safe, but it wasn't living. Do you feel like you're living now? He turned to look at her fully, his eyes reflecting the sunset's gold. More than I have in years. Margaret returned in mid-September with her sons and 3 ranch hands, ready to execute the combined roundup that would determine Eleanor's entire future. The crew was efficient, professional, and openly skeptical of the city woman who'd somehow convinced Margaret to take her seriously. "You're Brooks's niece?" one of the hands asked, a young man named Tom who looked like he'd been born on horseback. "You really think you can handle roundup work?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "I know I can. We'll see about that." The roundup began at first light the next morning. 30 people spread across the valley gathering cattle that had scattered over summer range. Eleanor rode with Caleb and 2 of Margaret's hands, working the eastern section where her uncle's cattle had drifted highest into the mountains. The work was everything Caleb had promised: brutal, exhausting, dangerous. Hours in the saddle navigating terrain that could kill you if you weren't careful. Cattle that didn't want to be driven and fought every attempt to control them. Heat and dust and the constant physical punishment of wrestling with animals that outweighed you 5-1. But Eleanor had trained for this, had spent 6 weeks learning exactly what this moment would demand. When Tom tried to cut off a steer that was breaking from the group, Eleanor anticipated the move and positioned herself to block the escape route. When a cow turned aggressive protecting her calf, Eleanor held her ground and used her rope to bring the animal under control without anyone getting hurt. When Caleb called for her to take point driving a group of 20 head down from High Meadow, she did it without hesitation, her commands firm and her positioning precise. By the end of the first day, Tom's skepticism had shifted to grudging respect. "You can actually ride," he said as they made camp for the night. "I had a good teacher." They worked for 5 days, gathering cattle from impossible terrain and driving them toward the central gathering point Margaret had established. Eleanor's body screamed protest every morning, her muscles so sore she could barely mount Sage. But she pushed through, refused to show weakness, worked harder than anyone except possibly Caleb, who seemed determined to prove Eleanor's competence by extension. On the 6th day, they began the sorting, separating Eleanor's broken S brand from Margaret's rocking H, identifying animals ready for market versus breeding stock to keep through winter. The count was meticulous, witnessed by Margaret and Caleb and recorded in ledgers that would determine debts paid or disasters realized. Eleanor stood beside the corral as her herd was tallied, her heart in her throat, knowing everything depended on numbers she couldn't control. Had her uncle's stock survived well enough? Had predation and disease and simple bad luck reduced her herd below viability? Margaret called out the final count. 143 head total, 87 ready for market, 32 breeding cows to keep, 24 calves too young to sell this season. 87 market animals. At current Denver prices of roughly $55 per head, that meant just under $4,800 gross, minus the costs of the drive, the hands' wages, Margaret's percentage for the combined operation. Eleanor did the arithmetic quickly, her hands shaking. It would be enough, barely, with almost nothing to spare, but enough to clear her debts and maintain the property through winter. Caleb saw the realization on her face and smiled. "You did it. We did it. I couldn't have managed without your help, without Margaret's support." "You did the work that mattered," Margaret said, approaching with her own ledger. "My boys said you pulled your weight and then some during roundup. That counts for more than you know." She handed Eleanor the paperwork detailing the financial breakdown. "Drive leaves for Denver in 2 days. You'll get your payment 6 weeks after sale, assuming market holds. Should be sufficient to clear your debts with maybe $300 remaining." $300. It seemed simultaneously like a fortune and nothing at all. Enough to survive winter, but not enough for real security. Enough to prove viability, but not enough to guarantee next year's success. "It's a start," Eleanor said. "It's more than that. It's proof you can do this." Margaret gripped Eleanor's shoulder with calloused strength. Your uncle would be proud. He spent years building what you've managed to maintain in just a few months. That's no small thing. After the cattle were loaded and the drive departed for Denver, after Margaret's crew dispersed and the valley returned to its normal quiet, Eleanor stood in her corral looking at the breeding stock she'd kept back. 32 cows, 24 calves, the foundation of next year's operation. Not enough to rebuild her uncle's peak herd, but enough to grow from if she managed them carefully. Caleb found her there as sunset approached, her hands on the corral rail, her expression thoughtful. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The future. What comes after this first success? And what does come after?" Eleanor turned to face him fully. "More work. Rebuilding the herd, improving the property, establishing myself as a legitimate rancher instead of someone who got lucky once. Years of effort to turn this inheritance into something truly mine. That's a lot of hard work ahead. I know, but I also know I want to do it. Not because I have no other options, not because I'm running from something, but because I've built something here worth keeping." She took his hand, felt the familiar roughness of his palm against hers. "And because I want to build it with you, not just as neighbors or business partners, but as something more permanent." Caleb's expression softened into something Eleanor had learned to recognize as deep emotion carefully controlled. "Eleanor Brooks, are you proposing to me?" "I'm saying I'm done being courted. I know my own mind, know my own feelings, and I know I want to spend my life building this ranch with a man who saw potential in me when I had none, who taught me everything I needed to survive, who worked beside me like an equal from the moment I proved I deserved it. That's not a proposal, that's a speech." "Then yes, Caleb Mercer, I'm proposing. Marry me. Make this partnership official and permanent. Help me turn 2 struggling ranches into 1 thriving operation." Caleb pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her. "You sure about this? Sure you want to tie yourself to a weathered rancher with more scars than prospects? I've never been more sure of anything. Are you? I've been sure since that storm when you ran out into the darkness chasing cattle you thought were yours. Knew then you had the stubbornness and determination to make this life work. Knew then I was falling for you even though I tried to fight it." He kissed her, deep and certain. "Yes, Eleanor. I'll marry you, build with you, spend my life showing you that betting on us was the smartest decision you've made since coming west." They married 3 weeks later in Westcliff, Margaret and Henderson serving as witnesses, the small church filled with ranchers who'd come to respect the city woman who'd refused to quit. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from fabric purchased with her first ranching profits, and Caleb wore his best clothes, which were still work-worn, but clean. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but when Eleanor promised to have and to hold through prosperity and hardship, she meant every word with a certainty born of months surviving hardship together. The reception was held at the Mountain Pride Hotel, the same place Eleanor had stayed her first uncertain night in the valley. Now she stood surrounded by neighbors who'd become friends, ranchers who'd become colleagues, celebrating not just a marriage, but the successful integration of an outsider into a tight-knit community. "You've done well," Henderson said, approaching with a glass of whiskey he'd clearly already been enjoying. "When you first arrived, I gave you 2 weeks before you ran back to Boston. Happy to have been wrong." "I'm happy to have proved you wrong." "Your uncle would be pleased. He always hoped someone would care about that land the way he used to, before grief took the joy from him. You've brought life back to a place that was dying." Eleanor looked across the room to where Caleb stood talking with Margaret's sons, his laugh genuine and easy, his posture relaxed in a way she'd never seen during those first cautious weeks. "We've brought life back. Together." The winter that followed tested everything Eleanor had learned. The cold came hard and early, temperatures plunging below zero, snow piling into drifts that buried fence lines, and made checking cattle a daily battle against nature's indifference. Eleanor and Caleb worked side by side, their combined herd sheltering in improved facilities they'd built together, sharing resources and labor in ways that made both operations stronger. They lost animals. Winter kill was inevitable, no matter how prepared you were, but they lost fewer than either would have alone. Their combined knowledge and doubled effort saving stock that would have perished under single management. Through the long, dark months, Eleanor learned new lessons. How to break ice on water tanks at 4 in the morning, how to recognize early signs of illness in cattle stressed by cold, how to endure weeks when the temperature never rose above freezing and every task required twice the effort. But she also learned what it meant to have genuine partnership, to work until exhaustion with someone who worked just as hard beside you, to collapse into bed too tired for words but comforted by shared warmth and shared purpose, to wake in darkness and face another brutal day knowing you weren't facing it alone. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked one particularly harsh night as they sat by the fire, too cold to sleep, listening to wind howl around the house. "Giving up city life for this?" Eleanor considered the question honestly. Did she miss Boston? The civilization, the predictability, the life that had seemed normal before that telegram arrived? "No," she said finally. "I miss who I thought I was before I came here. But that person was smaller, safer, living a life that fit but never challenged her to grow. This life," she gestured to the window where snow fell heavy and wind bent the trees. "It's harder than anything I imagined, but it's real in ways Boston never was. It's mine in ways that seamstress shop never could be." "Ours," Caleb corrected gently. "It's ours now." Spring came late but glorious, the snow melting to reveal grass that grew thick and green under mountain runoff. Eleanor's breeding cows dropped healthy calves. Margaret's herd expanded successfully, and the valley bloomed with a prosperity that felt earned through shared suffering. The second roundup was easier than the first, Eleanor's competence now established beyond question. She worked alongside Margaret's crew without anyone questioning her right to be there. Her skills sharp enough she could teach newer hands the techniques Caleb had taught her. The drive to Denver brought prices slightly higher than the previous year, and Eleanor's share cleared her remaining debts with enough surplus to purchase additional breeding stock. The ranch that had been barely viable was becoming genuinely profitable, the foundation solid enough to build on. Years passed in the rhythm of ranching, brutal winters and glorious springs, roundups that became annual gatherings, slow, steady growth of herds and holdings. Eleanor and Caleb combined their properties formally, creating an operation large enough to weather bad years and capitalize on good ones. They built a new house halfway between the original structures, larger and more comfortable, with windows that captured mountain views and a porch where they sat most evenings watching sunset paint the valley gold. The old houses became bunkhouses for seasonal hands during roundup, storage for equipment during off-season, monuments to where they'd started individually before becoming something stronger together. Eleanor bore 2 children, a daughter first named Sarah after Caleb's lost love, then a son they named Samuel after the uncle whose death had given Eleanor life. She taught them to ride as soon as they could walk, to work cattle before they learned to write, to respect the land that would someday be theirs if they proved worthy of the inheritance. Margaret became not just business partner, but genuine friend, someone Eleanor could turn to when ranching wisdom was needed, or when female perspective was required in a valley still predominantly male. They shared resources during hard times, celebrated together during good ones, built a network of support that made all their operations stronger. The valley changed slowly over the years. More settlers arrived, some succeeding and some failing, the pattern as old as westward expansion itself. But the core group, Eleanor and Caleb, Margaret and her sons, a handful of other ranchers who'd proven their capability through survival, formed the stable center around which the community organized. Eleanor became the person others consulted when newcomers arrived uncertain and unprepared. She remembered too well what that felt like, the terror of facing impossible odds with insufficient knowledge, and she offered help with the same patient firmness Caleb had shown her. Some took the help and succeeded. Others ignored it and failed. Eleanor learned to accept both outcomes without taking responsibility for choices others made. On their 10th anniversary, sitting on the porch watching their children play in the yard and the cattle graze across land they'd defended together through countless challenges, Caleb turned to Eleanor with an expression of quiet contentment. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd sold that first year, taken Henderson's advice and gone back east?" Eleanor considered the alternate life, perhaps teaching sewing in some eastern city, living quietly and safely, never knowing cold that could kill or work that could break you, or partnership that could sustain you through impossible odds. Sometimes, she admitted. Usually when I'm breaking ice on water tanks at 4 in the morning in January, or when we're losing calves to spring storms, or when the work seems endless and the progress invisible. But then I remember why I stayed. Not because I had no choice, but because I chose this. Chose the challenge, chose the land, chose you. Built something from nothing, turned an unwanted inheritance into a legacy worth leaving our children. She took his hand, their fingers intertwining with familiar ease. I regret a lot of decisions I've made in my life, Caleb. But staying here, fighting for this place, building this life with you, that's not one of them. Even when it's hard? Especially when it's hard. Easy things don't test you, don't show you what you're capable of becoming. Coming west forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed, to develop skills I never imagined needing, to become someone I'm actually proud of being. Their daughter Sarah came running up the porch steps, her face flushed with exertion and joy. "Mama, can I ride Sage to the north pasture? Samuel wants to check on the new calves." Eleanor looked at her daughter, 8 years old, confident in the saddle, already showing signs of the determination that ran through family lines. "Take your brother, stay together, and be back before dark." "Yes, Mama." Sarah ran off to collect her younger brother, their voices carrying across the yard as they argued about who would ride which horse. "They're growing up ranchers," Caleb observed. "Never know anything different than this life." Is that good or bad? It's honest. They'll have choices we didn't, education and opportunities this valley couldn't offer when we started. But they'll also have foundation, understanding of hard work and honest partnership, and what it takes to build something that lasts. He pulled Eleanor closer, his arm comfortable around her shoulders. They'll make their own choices about what kind of life they want, but at least they'll make them from a position of strength rather than desperation. As the sun set and their children rode toward the north pasture on horses that had once belonged to Eleanor and Samuel, as cattle grazed on land that had nearly been lost to debt and inexperience, Eleanor felt the weight of everything they'd built settle over her like a blessing rather than a burden. The inheritance she'd never wanted had become a legacy she was proud to pass forward. The land that had seemed impossible to manage had become home in the deepest sense of the word. The future that had looked like certain failure had transformed into something richer and more meaningful than anything she'd imagined back in Boston. And the man who'd started as a skeptical teacher had become the partner she couldn't imagine life without. Someone who'd seen potential when she had none, who'd demanded her best when she'd wanted to quit, who'd offered genuine partnership when she'd proven herself worthy of it. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting me fail. For teaching me what I needed to know. For seeing something worth investing in when I was just a desperate city woman with an unwanted inheritance." Caleb kissed her temple, gentle and familiar. "You never needed me to succeed, Eleanor. You needed someone to show you what was possible, but the strength to achieve it was always yours. I just helped you discover it. Then thank you for that, for helping me discover who I could become." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged in their impossible thousands, the valley quiet except for wind through grass and the distant sound of their children's laughter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always new challenges in ranching, fences that needed mending, cattle that needed tending, the endless cycle of work that defined this life. But tomorrow would also bring Caleb beside her facing those challenges together, would bring children growing strong and capable, learning lessons that would serve them whether they chose ranching or different paths, would bring another day of building on the foundation they'd established through years of shared effort and honest partnership. The inheritance Eleanor had never wanted had taught her everything about who she could become when pushed beyond imagined limits, had shown her that strength wasn't something you possessed, but something you developed through challenges that tested you, had given her a life richer and more meaningful than safety and comfort ever could have provided. She'd arrived in the Colorado Territory terrified, unprepared, and utterly alone, a city woman facing impossible odds with nothing but desperate determination. She'd become a rancher in her own right, respected by her community, capable of surviving challenges that would have destroyed the person she'd been. She'd built a marriage based on genuine partnership and mutual respect. She'd created a legacy worth leaving her children, property, and skills, and understanding of what it meant to work for something larger than yourself. The telegram that had shattered her old life had given her the chance to build something better. The uncle she'd barely known had left her more than land and cattle. He'd left her the opportunity to discover strength she didn't know she possessed. And the skeptical rancher who'd agreed to teach her had given her something more valuable than knowledge. He'd given her partnership, respect, love earned through shared hardship and mutual support. Eleanor Brooks, now Eleanor Mercer, had inherited a ranch she didn't want and built a life she couldn't imagine losing, had transformed unwanted inheritance into chosen legacy, turned desperate survival into genuine thriving, and proved that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for, but fought like hell to keep. As the last light faded from the western sky and darkness settled over the valley like a blessing, Eleanor held tight to Caleb's hand and smiled into the night. The work would continue tomorrow and the day after, and every day for the rest of their lives. But tonight, surrounded by land she'd learned to love and partnership she'd fought to build, Eleanor Brooks had everything she needed. She had home, purpose, family, and love. She had a legacy worth defending and a future worth building toward. She had arrived seeking land and found herself instead stronger, braver, more capable than she'd ever imagined possible. And that inheritance, earned through months of brutal work and years of dedicated partnership, was worth more than any property deed or bank account ever could be. The end.